If there's one thing I've learned from my life, it's to never make a huge life move before you're really ready for it. The experience that taught me this lesson was marrying a man 10 years older than me when I was way too young and dumb to realize what I wanted. Like a lot of girls where I'm from, I got married right out of high school. Unlike the other girls, however, I married a man a full decade older than me who was already well established. Now, at the time, this was a good move for me. Marrying Michael enabled me to go to college and live very comfortably without needing to work or worry about anything. He was honestly a dream come true, if a little inept in the common sense region. He made sure that I never wanted for anything, provided me with anything I could ever want or need, even introduced me to the connections that got me where I am now in my career. Without him, my life would have been a massive struggle. I didn't come from a well-off family. The only reason I even met Michael was due to a temp internship at his company. He was impressed with how hard I was working, how intelligent I was, how driven, the care I took in making the most out of the temporary position. We had a fast courtship, if you can really call it that. It was maybe 9 months total before he proposed. My parents were elated, and before I even graduated, I was basically living with him. He even gave me a new car and took me on a trip to the Bahamas as my graduation gift. Life was good for a long time. I didn't have to worry, didn't need to struggle. Michael made life easy. Everything was great. Of course, everything was like a fairy tale when you marry the wealthy prince. But there's a reason those stories end with happily ever after. No one needed to know that after the dream wedding came real life. Those princesses turned into mothers who ran households and raised children. Maybe this wasn't the most interesting turn of events. Certainly no one would want to listen to a story of a sleep-deprived woman doing her best to feed a baby and keep her home clean, while simultaneously making sure she looked nice. This was the part of the story I was ready for, though. At 27 years old, I was done with the fairy tale. Waking up to a spotlessly clean, quiet home every day began to weigh on me, the monotony and stagnation of it growing as the days went by. I watched my sister raising her own daughter with such envy I could cry. For the entirety of my life until meeting Michael, I had seen my future littered with bottles, tiny shoes, toys scattered on the living room floor, bedtime stories, and helping with homework. I wanted to go to parent-teacher conferences, participate in bake sales, watch my babies perform shitty little elementary school plays while I recorded them and cried in the audience. When Michael told me he was infertile, I had been crushed. But I loved him. I thought maybe I could accept that I would never have children of my own, that I would need to adopt. But when he explained to me that he never wanted children, I couldn't even respond. How could a man his age not want children? Did he not want a son to carry on his hard-won business empire? How could he have a fulfilling life without answering that basic biological need? Despite that avalanche of a revelation, I decided that I cared more for him than my own reproductive needs. I could focus on my career instead. My niece would serve as a surrogate child when my instincts overwhelmed me. I could get by and live happily without a baby in my life. I was wrong. As the years ticked by, it became more and more obvious that what I tried to stamp down within myself would not be silent forever. It poisoned my affections for Michael until I found myself crying every time I saw another of my friends announcing a pregnancy or a birth. My period every month sent me into sorrow and depression. It took less time than I'm proud to admit to start cheating. Something deep in my biological nature compelled me towards men who looked even remotely interested in me. I decided that if I became pregnant, I would tell Michael that I'd been raped during one of his long business trips away from home, and had been so scared and embarrassed that I didn't report it or even tell him. With a story like that, it would guilt trip him a little bit to make him feel like it was slightly his fault for leaving me alone in the first place. Part 2 of my genius plan was getting him to agree to let me keep the baby. My husband had known all along that I was pro-life. I am staunchly and openly against abortion, so it wouldn't be a surprise to him that I'd refuse to kill an innocent baby. It seemed obvious to me that it wouldn't take much work to get my way. The real problem seemed to be the fact I wasn't getting pregnant. Man after man, all of them seemingly gifted with unreasonable supplies, and yet I was still barren. I was beginning to think maybe I was infertile too, but wasn't willing to go get tested. There was a part of me that just couldn't take a confirmation like that. When I met Travis, I had just broken it off with another man who'd been sleeping with me, only to tell me later that he'd had a vasectomy years ago. I was in a shitty mood, feeling more useless than ever, and for some reason Travis was able to get me to giggle that morning when I stopped in to get a coffee. He was cute, a little dorky, very much a closet hipster, but I was a little smitten with him. A few weeks later, he divulged his wishes to have kids, and I knew I could hook him. I spun him my sob story of being in a barren relationship and desperately wishing for a family of my own. I watched the gleam in his eye as I said all the things I knew he wanted to hear. He never knew I only intended to use him as a sperm donor and then throw him out of the way as soon as a positive test came home. I want to make it clear that I never once considered leaving my husband at all. I would have never done it. I can't deny that I did enjoy the attention I got from Travis, though. He was good in bed, a good mix of kinky and comforting, but he could never hope to provide the type of life I lived. Sure, he was making a good profit owning that coffee shop, but I made more at my own job in a month than he made in 3 after overhead. I was just enjoying my time with Travis until my test came up positive, and after that he was going to be out of my way or going to jail. I didn't care which. At least that was my plan until Michael found out. I came home from work and found screenshots of everything I'd ever sent to Travis spread across the dining table. Michael was sitting at the table in a calm, relaxed pose as he ate a steak and held one of the pages like a newspaper. "I never knew you were into this kind of thing, Natasha," he said with a bemused tone, eyebrows raised as he turned the paper to show me a picture of myself with a collar and leash around my neck and all of Travis engulfed down my throat. I felt the blood drain down into my feet. My head swam, the room swirled, and I felt like I was going to throw up, and for a moment my vision tunneled as if I was going to faint. "Where did you get those?" I asked in not much more than a whisper. "You left yourself logged into your iTunes on my tablet, and lo and behold, what popped up as a notification. None other than you telling Mr. Bevins how much you enjoyed swallowing his cum last Sunday. Now, mistake me if I'm wrong, but you told me you were camping with Miranda last weekend." Everything crashed down around me in that moment, and I knew I had only seconds to plead my case. Tears immediately began pouring. I flung my sobbing self down in a chair while I poured out my prolonged rape tale to my husband. I went on about Travis blackmailing me into a long affair at the expense of ruining my marriage and leaking fake information about Michael being a pedophile. I even told him Travis threatened to have Michael killed if I didn't comply. I begged over and over for him to believe me and that I had only played along for his own well-being. He let me go on and on for a while until I ran totally out of words to say and had ugly cried myself into hysterics. But not once did he so much as pat my hand. I knew there was something wrong, but I couldn't accept yet that he wouldn't believe me. The man was a gullible pushover. He would take my side. I waited for long seconds to hear him say the magic words of having Travis arrested. Those words didn't come. Instead, I heard a chuckle. Michael laughed until he was coughing, spluttering, turning nearly purple from the rise in blood pressure. I had never seen him laugh so hard. It scared me more than if he had suddenly slapped me. "Natasha, I can read fluently in 6 languages, plus bullshit and slut," Michael wheezed between his chuckles. "There are pages upon pages of your texts with your sister about trying to get pregnant. I have video files of you fucking 6 different men, enough pictures you've sent of you nude to publish a magazine, and years worth of your dirty texts. I've got it all right here, and on flash drives that I've already sent to my lawyer to start the divorce proceedings. You're divorcing me? I whispered. My voice was hoarse from crying. My face was streaked in makeup and tears. I looked like a mess and felt even worse. How could such a fuck-up be going on? Of course I am, he exclaimed with a big grin on his face. Why in the hell would I stay with a cheating whore who wants me to raise some illegitimate kid? You're going to leave me after everything we've been through. What do you expect me to do? I demanded. Michael shrugged. You're more than welcome to go ahead and be with your hipster boy, because I sure as hell will not suffer a skink under my roof another minute. This set me off. This is our house, Michael. You can't just kick me out of it. He only laughed harder. Oh, you're gonna find out that I very much can. I owned this house for 5 years before you ever moved into it. You have absolutely no rights to it. I can kick you out any time I want. Doesn't hurt that the prenup is on my side as well. I felt my whole body go cold. I had known about the prenup, of course, but I hadn't considered that the house wasn't marital property. In all honesty, I had never thought Michael wouldn't take my side. This was a total blindside. Where do you expect me to go? I demanded. He rolled his eyes as he inspected a sheet of paper imprinted with some of my sex with Travis. You can go to your sister, since she was clearly supportive of all your sluttery. You can go to a hotel room, since you have your own money. You can even go stay with your boyfriend for all I care, but you are not staying here. You expect me to go live with my own rapist? I questioned, my voice raspy and graveled as I leveled a glare at my husband, determined to make him see things my way. Michael smirked at me over the rim of his wine glass. You and I both know there's no raping a willing participant. It was at this point that I lost myself to the biggest fit I've had since I was a little girl. I grabbed the papers and tore them apart, throwing them at Michael while I screamed. You are out of your fucking mind! I shrieked while rampaging. It's not my fault I was forced into this god-awful situation just to be degraded and called a whore by my own husband. Well, I wouldn't be calling you a whore aside from the fact that, well, you're a whore, Michael responded in a smirking taunt. This did nothing to calm me. I swear to God, if you try to kick me out of my own home, I will call the police immediately and tell them everything. Everything about Travis, about your pedophilia, and I'll tell them you're an abusive asshole. Nothing I said seemed to perturb him in the least. There's no pedophilia to find on me, so there's one hole in your glorious plan, he pointed out. I glared at him, a mean smirk spreading over my tear-stained face. Miranda will back me up on it. All we have to do is say Alicia told us all about how you've been touching her, and you're fucking ruined. I spread my hands out on the hardwood table and leaned down to get eye level with him. No judge is going to go against a little girl saying her big, strong uncle was grabbing her, and as soon as even a breath of it got out, you'd be ostracized from every business partner and opportunity you have lined up. And as soon as you're in prison, I can file for divorce myself and take everything I want from you. You want to play this game with me? I can do it to you, impotent prick. Michael sighed, but didn't respond, a sign I took to be defeat. I couldn't hold the triumphant sneer off my face. That's what I thought, I said. Now, I'm going to go get a bath, love. It's been a long day. As I walked behind him, I gave him a taunting kiss on the top of his balding head, then grabbed the bottle of wine and glass he'd been drinking before making my way into the bathroom. Inside the room, I closed and locked the door to ensure my safety in case he went into a craze out there alone. In reality, I didn't expect to have any more trouble out of him. He was weak-willed and had never been in a real argument in his entire life. I was fairly certain he was more likely to kill himself than he was to try anything with me. And If he did kill himself, that was one less thing I'd have to worry about. I could take all the goodies we had together, including the money from his bank account, sell off his businesses, and live out my life on a beach in Mexico. With a charcoal mask on my face and my third glass of wine, I sank down into the bubbles of my bath while music played. The alcohol made the hot water that much more enjoyable, my stunning victory over my husband making me giggle the more I thought about it. He was book smart, but not crafty. Unlike me, he had never lived under the poverty level, never had to take unfair chances to get what he needed. Michael thought everyone operated in honest terms that could be verified on paper with a contract. He didn't understand that sometimes people need to get their hands dirty and use others to accomplish things. After an hour of steady wine consumption and lavender bathwater, my eyes were heavy. Before I could accidentally fall asleep in the water, I got out and dried off, choosing to make my trek to the bed without getting dressed. I noticed the bed was empty as I came out of the ensuite. There were no sounds coming from the rest of the house either, so I assumed he'd either gone down into the basement man cave to sleep, or had entirely left the house. So much for it being his house, I thought from under the blankets. As I drifted off, the thought crossed my mind that maybe he had gone out to end himself, and I began to feel guilty. It wasn't his fault he was born sterile. It wasn't even his fault that he didn't want kids. I hated being called a whore for trying to get my way, but I could kind of see his side of things. I was definitely in the wrong. Even if I would never admit to it, I had known I was in the wrong the whole time. And of course, it wasn't like I didn't love Michael. I wanted to be with him and have a family with him, but I had let my biological needs get in the way of what was truly attainable. He couldn't have kids. He didn't want to adopt. He probably would never be happy raising a child produced through rape with me either. I grabbed my phone and sent him a text to let him know I was sorry about the fight and threatening him, that I was going to bed, loved him, and would see him in the morning when we could talk about it further. Then I snuggled down into the plush bedding and finally gave in to the waves of sleep. Facebook Messenger, August 10th, 2014, 8:09 p.m. To Miranda Lazarus, from Michael Bricken. Hey Miranda, just saw you log on and I thought I'd message you, see how things are going. I heard about Adkin's new job and wanted to congratulate you guys on good fortune. He's been wasting away in that office for way too long anyway. It was time for a change. Natasha told me about Alicia making the honor roll again and being enrolled for the spelling bee. I can't believe how smart she is for just 5 years old. I know you both talk about how odd it is for her to be sleepwalking in the middle of the night, but I don't think you need to worry. She's a very smart little girl, and I'm sure it's just something minor. I feel like I remember Adkin mentioning he had an aunt who sleepwalked. Anywho, I wanted to talk to you about your delightful sister. I know you're already fully aware of what she's been up to since I logged onto her account a few hours ago and happened to find your conversation, along with a lot of other evidence. As you know, she's been cheating on me with a man from the coffee shop next door to her work. The one with the massive spinning coffee cup for a sign? Yep, real winner, right? Well, I already know what you think of him since I've seen your messages and whatnot. You really think she'd be so much happier with a low-income hipster than a financially secure, well-mannered, loving husband. Just because I'm impotent? Just because you think I'm gay because I like to dress well? I'm sorry not all of us want to dress like a thrift shop hobo. Well, we're all entitled to our own opinion. Even if they're selfish, you wanting to be an aunt is a very poor excuse for encouraging her horrible behavior. Maybe it's because of how huge a failure you are as a mother that you want my wife to breed like some bitch dog. Little nieces and nephews for you to play with now that Alicia's getting out of her cute phase, right? She's not as cute anymore, not letting you dress her up and parade her around. Now that she's developing a personality, you don't want her. What a useless excuse for a parent you are. If you're so desperate to have small children in your life, why don't you have more of your own? Oh, that's right! Adkin won't fuck you more than twice a year. You have to get him drunk and loaded up on Viagra to get him hard enough to put it in you. He told me all about it. Said you stopped shaving, look like a fucking gorilla, and don't even shower as much as you used to. That's disgusting. Take better care of yourself before you start giving advice to other people. Between you and I, it's no wonder Adkin's been playing with the babysitter. Sadie's pretty cute and a lot more polite than you are to him. If you were half as attentive to him as a little babysitter is, maybe he'd fuck you more. Or maybe if you'd go take a fucking shower and groom. I don't blame him even a little bit, especially knowing that shit personalities run in your family. Hope Alicia doesn't inherit it. Anyway, back to why I originally decided to reach out to you. I've had enough time to think about what I found. I saw all the pictures synced to her iTunes, all the slutty videos and messages. I never knew she was even that flexible. Do you know she likes being choked out? I didn't, and I wish to God I never had the unfortunate chance to see the video of his bony claw for a hand wrapped around her neck with him begging her to go harder. Who in the hell gets off to that? Honestly, I was so furious when I first found her account still logged in on my iPad that I thought about killing her. I fantasized about bashing in her skull with a hammer when she came in from work, tying her up, doing horrendous things to make her pay for the pain I was in. I wanted to break her bones slowly, pull her hair out strand by strand, use that hot wax she loves to rip her skin off in sheets. For a while, I even entertained the notion of killing her boyfriend in front of her in the basement. That got me going again. Sorry, didn't mean to get so descriptive. Don't worry. She's alive and well with that coffee shop hippie. For now. If she stays that way is up to you. I may not have hurt her much, but I have put her in a position that can end her life easily. It just takes a long time. It's been about 3 hours now. I've spent all this time waiting on you to log on so I could message you. You see, since you were such a supporter of her slutty ways, I decided that there would be no better solution to this problem than to get all 3 of you at the same time. Her and her boyfriend have been put in a secure container somewhere in the map I'm sending along with this message. I want you to suffer with the knowledge that you can save her and the man you want to father your nieces and nephews. But know that you have such a low chance of success. Their punishment is being together till death do them part, like she promised to me. I'm not giving you any more clues than the map, but there's a clue in the map itself that will take you directly to her. I don't think you're intelligent enough to figure it out, though. Happy hunting, sister-in-law! Natasha and I met at the coffee shop I own about 8 months ago. Her office building was next door, so she stopped in some mornings for coffee before work. At first, we only exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather, shared little stories about our lives while I made her coffee. We developed a little friendship from there. She started coming for lunch in the cafe once a week, then twice, until eventually she had lunch there most days. We were enjoying each other's company greatly. It was apparent that we were extremely compatible, clicking on so many levels that my mind was blown. Never had I met a woman who seemed to just know what I meant before I could even get the idea out. I knew she was married. I respected that annoying fact and kept our conversations friendly, even though I knew within days that I had already fallen. I wanted her. What led to my current predicament was when, a few weeks into our friendship, she brought up wanting kids. I've always wanted a family, but without meeting the right woman, I'd never had the opportunity. Natasha had married a man whose infertility made her lifelong dream of becoming a mother impossible. From what I always understood, beyond doubt she loved her husband. He was loving, understanding, without a violent outburst to his credit, but he couldn't give her the kid she wanted so desperately. He literally couldn't provide for the most prevalent aspiration she had, and although she had gone into the marriage knowing this information, it had still wormed itself into an angry knot. Natasha's need to have kids outweighed the dedication she had pledged to her marriage. She said her relationship felt like an eternal honeymoon. At some point in the 6-year marriage, she had even considered getting pregnant by another man, but knew she couldn't get away with it. Instead, she wanted to divorce him and start over with a man who could give her the only thing she thought she wanted. From what she said, she was only still playing the marriage game because she had nowhere else to go. Logically, I understood that a woman with such an attitude was fickle and a bad idea to get involved with. For all I knew, she may have been using me as a means to get pregnant and somehow convince her husband that it was his. I had never met the man, so he could have been gullible enough to believe it was some sort of miracle conception and never question it further. Unfortunately, even though I was a smart man, I was also a young man. And like most young men, I thought with my dick in this type of situation instead of my brain. We started dating not long after Natasha confessed that to me. For months now, she'd been repeating to me that she was just about to break it off with him to come live with me. We were going to start a whole new life together. She kept saying she was just waiting for the right time, and I was beginning to realize that I was just a fling when her husband found out on his own. I don't know how he managed, but I now wish I had never gotten involved with his wife. He accosted me on the way to my car last night after closing the shop. I can only remember seeing him walking up to me with a jovial wave and a big toothy smile on his doughy, tanned, stereotypically middle-class face. Seeing him for the first time in person drove home to me how worlds apart we truly were, as if we weren't even from the same planet. Next thing I knew, I was waking up in absolute darkness. I was horrified. The left side of my head throbbed so hard my empty vision pulsed red with every heartbeat. My blood pressure must have been through the roof, nearing panic attack, if not fainting levels. My wrists hurt as if I'd been dragged by them for a long distance, and I could feel the burning of scrapes on my bare feet. My shoes were gone, but I was still in my coat and pants. It was stifling in my dark new domain, and I began struggling to get out of my coat, only to discover how confining the environment was. There was only a little more space than what an average double bed would provide. In my struggle to escape my coat, I accidentally jabbed my elbow into a small mass to my left. I heard a groan that I recognized and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. "Please don't wake up. Please do not wake up," I pleaded silently to any god merciful enough to answer my appeal. I didn't dare to breathe as my heart throbbed in my ears, and I lay there immobile. The lump beside me didn't make another noise. It shifted a bit, but didn't move again. After a minute, I dared to breathe again. I reached out, feeling the feverish skin of a familiar body in the confining space. It was Natasha lying next to me. To my utter horror, it was my girlfriend. This only served to terrify me further. Natasha was the worst claustrophobic I have ever met. She was the worst I have ever even heard of. Her phobia was so severe that she required medication to make it possible for her to even get into a car without an anxiety attack. A memory of her blackening my eye while trying to escape a too-enclosing hug when she'd forgotten her meds taunted me with what she would do if she knew her current situation. She was breathing steadily, and for the moment that was good enough for me. Even with my coat off, it was still horribly hot. I checked through my pockets in search of my phone in the vain hope that it was still there. I was elated to find its boxy shape in the inner pocket of my coat. I pulled it out, happy beyond reason when the screen lit up brightly to show it even had a full battery. Not until I tried to make a call to 911 did I realize the utter cruelty the other man was capable of. The SIM card had been removed, making my phone nothing but an awkward flashlight. I didn't even bother to check Natasha's pockets for fear of waking her. I slowly swung the lit screen around to see my environment. The roof was only an arm's length tall. I estimated the walls around 4 feet apart, meaning it was just wide enough for 2 people to lay shoulder to shoulder. Lengthwise, I could stretch out my limbs and touch each end with the tips of my fingers and toes. The entire structure looked like cheap plywood. It had the rough texture that always signified the low-budget material. This could be good, though. If we were being held in a flimsily made box, then I may be able to break us out of it before Natasha could become aware of the situation. Carefully, I rolled onto my chest, getting my knees under me to press my back against the roof. With a deep, slow intake of breath, I pushed against the roof as hard as I could. At first, there was nothing. Then a splintering sound issued overhead as I strained harder, my knees screaming in pain at the pressure, and I felt a horrid pop in my lower back. The pain crumpled me back to the rough floor. For a long time, all I could do was lay there gasping as quietly as possible, trying desperately not to wake Natasha as agony raced through me. Very gently, I reached behind me, tracing the tips of my fingers along the huge knot in my lower back. The spot screamed at me, sent me curling up again for long minutes as tears and snot dripped down my face. I bit into my arm to stifle my gasps. It was a long time before the pain began to die down again, allowing my brain to stop focusing solidly on the sensations from my back. Moving slowly, I reached up to feel the crack I'd made. The tips of my fingers caught on splinters of wood, but also damp, cold dirt. Its gritty texture sank my stomach down into my toes. Until that moment, I only thought that we were being held in a box in Natasha's basement, maybe a workshop somewhere. But I hadn't entertained the idea that we were buried. My heart lodged in my throat. My lungs refused to take in any air. I tried to think myself calm again. Okay, yes, I was buried alive with a woman who was incredibly claustrophobic. Yes, I was injured. Was I doomed, though? Probably. My cynical inner voice piped up unhelpfully. I was deep into the thoughts of possible escape when the barest whisper of cool air blew over my sweat-soaked forehead. As I stretched my arms up, I was able to feel a tiny wisp of breeze across my palm. I carefully wiggled up to the top of the enclosure, shining my screen around to find a little hole about the circumference of a quarter. The excitement that discovery brought was disorienting. That hole meant our box was still connected to the outside world. I cupped my hands around my mouth and went to scream into the hole, desperate for someone to help us, but screeched to a halt. A crippling fear sank into my chest. If I screamed for help, Natasha would wake up. If Natasha woke up, she would absolutely lose her shit. She may kill me and her both while struggling to escape. A vicious image invaded my brain of her clawing my eyes out in a blind panic, bashing her own head in on the ceiling, maybe even freaking out so badly she went into cardiac arrest. I opted instead for stealth, pointing my light into the hole. There was just a rubber tube that curved sharply upward. Turning off the screen, I let my eyes readjust to the darkness, then pressed my eye to the hole, then pressed my light to the hole, but could see no light at all. Swapping my eye for my ear only allowed me to hear a soft rush of winter air. No animals, traffic, nothing. Silence. The idea that we may be in a field or somewhere extremely remote dawned on me. From what I knew of Natasha's husband, he was no handyman. He owned businesses that sold art supplies, high-end camera and recording equipment, and did a lot on the stock market. Surely she would have told me if he was a craftsman during his downtime. She said he liked to go to flea markets and antique car shows, but nothing about if he liked to build things. He didn't look like the type to have access to any land or tools needed to pull off something like burying his wife and her boyfriend alive. Was someone helping him? Had she ever mentioned him having friends capable of something like this? I wanted so badly to scream through that hole for someone to hear me, rescue us, and get that psycho motherfucker who did this to us put in a ward deep underground where he belonged, but I couldn't. I didn't have the will to risk waking Natasha yet. What would I need to do to get out of this awful situation with all of my limbs intact? With my brain fuzzy from pain and throbbing, all I could do was let thoughts sluggishly swill around the inside of my skull. The cold air blowing in a thin stream across my face was enough relief to focus on, at least. Its freshness helped to clear some of the mental fog, allowing me to think more concisely. No light came from the little hole, so I could at least assume that it must be nighttime. Night meant that there wouldn't be anyone outside to even hear me if I did go off screaming like a nutcase. If I were careful, and incredibly fortunate, perhaps, I could keep my ear to the hole, wait until someone was nearby, and get their attention without waking Natasha. It felt like I was asking the universe itself to align, and I knew it was an unlikely scenario, but it was all I had to keep me going. Disoriented by the dark, head trauma, the damage to my back, and the heat, I just lay there on the hard plywood floor. I was dizzy, out of breath, and red splotches were blooming across my empty vision. I managed to position myself so that the tiny air hole blew across my sweat-soaked face. Beside me, Natasha was no more awake than before. I assumed whatever he did to knock her out was chemical instead of a hard blow to the head. Maybe he had chloroformed her, or she could be having a bad reaction that sent her into a coma. In the back of my lizard brain, I hoped she was in a coma, unable to come to in this sweltering, sweaty hell. It was probably for the best that she remained unconscious. I couldn't keep from imagining the panic if she knew where she was. I envisioned her frantically flailing and clawing to get out. I pictured her long, painted nails digging trails into the flesh of my throat, opening my arteries, bleeding me out in this grave. These thoughts weren't helping me. I was starting to get panicky, thinking about how bad the situation could still get. For a few long minutes, I lay as still as possible while bringing my breathing back to a manageable level. It was no small nor simple task to achieve, but at long last, I was able to breathe like a normal person. After an eternity, I started to see light coming through the little hole. It must have been hours since our entrapment began, and the box was a sauna now. Sweat coated my entire body, skin feeling like it was baking. Natasha's skin, however, was clammy and cool to the touch. I wrapped my scalding limbs around her chilling comfort only to become aware of how shallow her breathing had become. "You still alive down there?" A barely familiar voice asked down the tube connected to the hole. I scrambled up to the top of the box, ignoring the horrid pain that sudden movement caused. "Help!" I pleaded pitifully, my voice only just loud enough to be heard so as not to wake my partner. "Oh no. No. Can't do that," the voice responded, sounding so pleased. My fingertips went numb as I recognized who I was speaking to. "Please, just get us out of here. I won't tell anyone. I'll even leave the fucking country if that's what you want. Just please get us out." A soft chuckle sounded from the hole. "She's still asleep?" I was confused at that question. "Yeah, she's in a coma, I think. She needs help. If you loved her, you'd get her the help she needs, not leave her here like this." The only response I got was a loud air horn blast and the tiny light of the hole going out. Time froze for a moment. I could feel the stirring of limbs next to me, hear the sleepy noises of another person waking up. My whole body went numb. "Oh God, no," I whispered to myself. "Travis?" I moved as far from her as I could get. "Don't move," I commanded, thinking fast. "You probably can't feel it, but you're really injured and moving will make it worse. Just stay still." Her breathing hitched in the darkness. "What happened? I can't see." The sound of her hands scraping against the floor spiked my blood pressure further. "There was an accident? Please, just don't move or feel around, Natasha." She wasn't listening. Her hands continued to feel around her. I could hear the moment reality struck her upon feeling the ceiling inside of the box so close to her. She began to scream. It was louder than I thought a human could be. I covered my ears out of instinct. Within moments, she was thrashing, her feet and arms and knees bashing and bruising me. I tried to tell her to stop, to just lie still, but she was utterly mindless. In desperation, I struggled over to her and wrapped my arms and legs around her. My back injury screamed at me as I moved, her nails scraping into my flesh, teeth bit hard into my arm. Natasha's strength in her panic state far surpassed my own, and I realized this quickly. I fought to get my arm under her chin. With every ounce of power in my body, I squeezed against her neck. Her fighting only intensified at first. Natasha slammed her head backwards, breaking my nose and knocking two of my front teeth into my mouth. The struggling repeatedly slammed my own head into the wall, serving only to worsen my concussion as I spat blood and did my damnedest to hold her still. "Natasha, just stop moving. If you stop thrashing around, I can let you up," I pleaded with her. I don't know if she just couldn't hear me, or if she was so far gone that she didn't have any control over herself. One of her hands reached up to my face, tearing at my beard and mouth. 2 fingernails hooked my lower lip and ripped it before I could stop her. She dug one elbow like a baseball bat into my ribs, finally managing to dislodge me from the stranglehold I had on her. A moment later, she was on me. Long fingernails broken by fighting scraped long trails of skin from my forehead and cheeks, one gouging into my eye even through the lid. The coffin was a dark tomb full of our animalistic screaming as we both fought to protect ourselves. Her from the enclosed environment, and me from her. Neither of us could win. I managed to get myself behind her, one arm against her throat and my legs wrapped around to hold her arms to her sides. "Natasha, I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry." I repeated this mantra over and over as I squeezed against her neck, blood pouring into the back of my throat and drooling down my chin from the broken teeth. Her thrashing began to slowly weaken. Eternity went by in moments as I listened to her frantic gasps slowly space out as I pressed harder and harder until there was a sudden, loud, unmistakable pop and she went instantly limp. All at once, my injuries came back at me in full force. I let go and collapsed. Had I known our affair would come to this, I'd have never even given her the time of day. If only I hadn't been so stupid, so foolhardy, and so desperate for female companionship. If only I'd known. Day 1. Even though I have a regular diary, I'm going to use this to log about the weird crap happening at work. As an explanation, I work at a nursing home in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's a 3-floor facility with a maximum capacity of 500 residents in their own private rooms. I won't state the name of the place since it would break my HIPAA contract, but I'll give as much info as I can. Normally, everything is really average. Lots of beeping, old people crying, staff talking, all the awful smells you can expect from an establishment filled with incontinent adults. It's a far cry from glamorous on a good day and downright nasty on a bad one, but generally the atmosphere hovers in the middle. Usually you can tune out the background noise, and you become noseblind to the regular smell of antiseptic and full adult briefs. The weird comes in the form of most of the staff thinking the 50-year-old building is haunted. To be fair, hundreds of people have died in there. Many of those were depressed, unloved, and unwanted elderly people. I could see where a few of those people would hang around. A few of the highly religious among staff even believe there are demons roaming the halls. Personally, I'm not sure. I've been there about 2 months as a part-time housekeeper on the first floor, which is the floor for people recovering before going home. None of those residents are permanent. Not too many have up and died on that floor. Not much goes on. Things have gone missing or shown up in weird places, but I feel pretty safe. Floor 2 is for long-term residents who have no mental problems. They're as average as you can expect. I haven't gotten to spend much time there, so I can only report what others have told me. Staff on the second floor talk about seeing residents who have passed away walking the halls, sometimes showing up at the nurse's station asking the charge nurse questions. It's freaky, but no one ever seems to feel threatened. That's where the top floor comes in. The third floor is reserved exclusively for residents with diseases like Alzheimer's, late-forming personality disorders, violent outbursts, etc. I was only up there once, but it wasn't fun. In Arkansas, residents have the right to scream and hit themselves or even throw themselves to the floor. As long as they don't injure other residents, the nurses aren't allowed to stop them unless they're really hurting themselves. So, imagine walking onto a ward that's nearly dead silent except for periodic screaming from far off down the halls. You don't even hear any TVs because 90% of the elderly are loopy from their antipsychotic meds and don't care about anything. The nursing staff is so jaded they don't look like they even hear it anymore. I hate going up there, and I'm always glad to not be there when I hear about all the stories of residents suddenly choking to death on nothing. Sometimes the nurses talk about seeing shapes like white shadows moving across the walls in the middle of the day. The shadows slip into the patient rooms, then the door will slam shut and the resident inside starts screaming. By the time the CNAs get the door open, the poor old person will be splayed out on the floor covered in bruises and very much dead. I wouldn't be nearly as bothered by all this, but I've been offered a full-time position to work on the 3rd floor. As much as it freaks me out, I have to accept it. Right now I'm only part-time on the 1st floor. Switching will give me $1 raise per hour, 15 more hours a week, and medical benefits. I can't afford to turn down that kind of offer. So, I thought it might be fun to keep a catalog of anything crazy, creepy, weird that might go on. Wish me luck! On the first day in the ACU, Alzheimer care unit for all you lucky enough not to work in a medical establishment, and there's already been a death. I don't think it can be connected to the stories I heard though. I overheard that it was a diabetic seizure, but maybe it was one of the White Shadow's victims. So spook. I also haven't seen the White Shadow yet. It's only the first day though, so there's still plenty of time for ghostly activity. Day 11. Sorry for not logging every day, but I've been really tired. All those extra hours are taking it out of me. Anyone who's ever worked housekeeping/janitorial work will understand what I mean. It sounds easy to just clean all day, but it is a physically taxing occupation. Anyway, the 3rd floor is just as creepy as I described. We're allowed to have one earbud in to listen to music while we work, and I wholeheartedly do so. On the 1st floor, I used to listen to creepypasta while I worked. I could get so distracted by the stories that I wouldn't even realize I was working until hours later when all my work was finished. On my first day on floor 3, I tried to do the same, but I got so freaked out I had to turn on an Alice in Wonderland audiobook to distract myself. Aside from the screaming and the crying, my first few days were actually pretty normal. There was that death my first day, but there's not enough correlation between what I've heard and what happened with that man to say for sure if it fits. Today, though, some shit went down. I've been talking to a CNA, I'll call him Thomas, who works the same shift as I do on that floor. He's into some of the same stuff as me. Likes creepypasta and horror movies, listens to similar music. We get along pretty well, and we're the only 2 people under 30 working up there. I was getting near the end of my lunch break and just standing there talking to Thomas about a concert he's going to next weekend. Everything had been really quiet the whole day, and we were only an hour or so out from clock out time, so we were pretty relaxed when all of a sudden, we both see this white thing move out of the corner of our eyes. In unison, we turn our heads and instantly the door to Mr. Marsh's room slams shut so hard the wind from it blows my hair back. Thomas vaulted over the desk and tried the door handle, but it won't even turn. From inside, we could hear the elderly man yell once before it was cut off. As soon as he heard the scream, Thomas was kicking at the door, trying to get it down. It took him 3 tries to bash the door in by kicking the part just under the doorknob, but he got it down and we both ran in. Mr. Marsh had slipped out of his recliner where he'd been napping. He was now on the floor. A puddle of blood was seeping from under his head, it was smeared all over his face, and there was a long spray of it across the bottom of the white curtain beside him. I was in shock, staring at the gory scene before me when something near my foot caught my attention. I looked down, and my lunch instantly came up the back of my throat and spilled all over the floor. It was a poor old man's tongue flopping near my shoe. More CNAs and nurses rushed in then, and one of them grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me out of the room. I got sat in the break room with some hot coffee and anti-nausea medication. I had to write out a statement of my view of events to put in the report. My manager got the other 2 housekeepers to finish the little bit I had left to clean on my haul and sent me home early. If you're wondering, yeah, Mr. Marsh is dead. Way dead. Not only did he bite off his own tongue, but he bashed the back of his head in on the floor. Not too surprising, to be honest, since the bones and skulls of old people are super soft and fragile. But having seen it in person is so much worse than I thought. I'll talk to Thomas tomorrow and see what he thinks happened. Personally, I think I saw my first instance of the ghost. Day 12. Thomas talked to me about what happened yesterday. He told me that this wasn't the first door kicking he's committed. Since these weird instances started happening, it's become acceptable to kick down the doors as long as there's cause to think the resident is in danger. The administrator herself made the order. Thomas said that's the first time that he's seen anyone bite through their own tongue like that. Usually someone will choke on their tongue during a seizure, but usually an elderly person who isn't even wearing their dentures has a hard time biting through such a tough piece of muscle. He was getting nervous while we were talking, but I kept pressing until he finally admitted what had gotten to him. When the doors first started getting jammed, all locks were removed from the doors on the third floor resident rooms. So, when he went to open the door yesterday, nothing mechanical was holding that door closed. He couldn't understand it. He and the maintenance man had gone back after the body was removed and the room cleaned to inspect the door mechanism, only to find there was nothing out of place. It's more like someone was holding the doorknob from the other side to keep me from being able to turn it, Thomas told me. There was nothing else to hold it closed like that. Day 16. Another resident became a victim to the ghost. Thankfully, I didn't witness this one, but it did happen on my hall. I ended up having to deep clean the room because the woman sprayed vomit all across the walls. Thomas and I decided to partner up on this. Both of us are completely freaked out, but also incredibly curious. We're going to share information to each other whenever one of us learns anything new. Hopefully, it'll be a while before I report another death. Day 25. For a week now, nothing new has happened. It's been pretty average. One of the comatose residents went to the hospital because her heart was becoming irregular, but that's been the height of excitement. On a less creepy note, Thomas and I are getting along really well. Wink wink. Maybe the whole ghost nonsense is doing some good after all. We're going to see a show this weekend and have been spending our lunches together to hash out all the facts about the paranormal activity at work. Basically just theorizing about it until we go off topic. Day 29. Miss Anne, the comatose woman, came back from the hospital last night. I went into her room to clean like usual and about died of fright when she said hello to me. In nearly a month of cleaning her room, I'd never seen her awake. That blew me away, but unnerved me too. She's an ancient woman in her early hundreds. I think she's 103 years old. For my whole stint on the third floor, she has laid in her bed looking like a shrunken, pallid, wrinkled thing. I can't even say she looked like a person, to be quite frank with you all. At best, she looked like a breathing mummy without any wrappings. There had barely been any hair left to her. Her skin was thin and kinda yellowish, and she was so thin you could barely tell she even had a body under the mountain of blankets she kept wrapped in. Now that she's awake and been away for a little while, she's like another person. Her skin's not as wrinkled and discolored, her cheeks are fuller, even her hair looks like it has started growing back. Aside from her sudden rejuvenation, she was just all around unnerving. The whole time I was in her room cleaning, she was having awkward, polite chat. She asked me about myself, but weird questions. She wanted to know if I smoke or drink or do drugs. At one point, she even asked if I'm sexually active, of all the weird things for a 103-year-old woman to wonder at. She sounded really pleasant, but the conversation was just so weird. Maybe tomorrow she'll go to the lunch hall with the other residents, and I'll be able to clean her room while she's gone. Day 37. This is my first day off, so I'll finally get to update. Miss Anne is simply getting creepier. I thought that maybe I'd get used to her, but nope, doesn't look to be happening. It's getting so off-putting that I thought about asking to trade her room with one of the other housekeepers. Miss Anne is getting healthier and gaining vitality every time I see her. Her skin is getting smoother and more colored, hair is growing back fuller, and she's even started walking. The woman was comatose for 3 months, on life support, but now she's up walking. I don't know about you, but to me that just reeks of something unnatural. No, I don't have any proof or even a theory yet, but I do think she's connected to the ghost somehow. She scares me. I don't understand why. An old woman who's recovering isn't anything to be afraid of, even if it is unnatural. Yesterday, she started talking to me as soon as I came in to clean and didn't stop until I told her goodbye. I didn't pay the story as much attention since I had one earbud in, but I got a feeling that something about what she was saying wasn't correct. Not sure what, since I was too freaked out by her to pay attention to what she was saying. Thomas told me there's been another death on the ward. A woman in her 50s with early onset Alzheimer's. Aside from the mental disease, she was in perfect health. The Alzheimer's had only affected her memories. It hadn't yet started on making her body forget how to work. In the middle of meal service, she just dropped dead. That's the youngest one by far. Certainly the healthiest. All the others were over 80 and their bodies had already begun to give out. Thomas doesn't know if she can be connected to the others because her age and health differences. He says that even more convincing was that there was no white shadow that marked the harbinger for the other victims. Here's my opinion. What if something were to happen that made the shadow better able to hide? What if it was strong enough now to keep us from seeing it? I got a hunch to look into before I voice it. Day 38. I was right! Okay, so a bit of a backstory is needed here. I have a family friend who works over at the hospital. Let's call her Hilda. Hilda works all over the place in there because she's been there 20 plus years. She's compassionate beyond reason, and that causes her to do a few things that are beyond her nursing duties. One of those activities is sitting with the dying patients who have no family. I asked her if she had come across a 100-plus-year-old comatose woman who was in the hospital not too long ago. Much to my expectations, Hilda had indeed sat at the bedside of the very same dying woman I was thinking of. Hilda told me that she had been sitting with the woman after her shift ended, holding her hand so she wouldn't be alone when she passed. It was getting a bit late. Hilda had worked a long shift, and she was falling asleep next to the bed when a life support alarm began going off in the room next door. She rushed out to see what was going on to find that one of the other comatose patients on the hall had flatlined. While nurses were trying to resuscitate that person, another person across the hall flatlined as well. One after another, 15 comatose people in stable condition just up and died. The doctors were scratching their heads after all the commotion died down, but no one could come up with an explanation. Hilda went back to check on and sit with the woman who had been on the verge of death, only to find her sitting up in bed with a huge smile on her face. One guess who that woman was. No one has been able to explain the deaths yet, and it's all being kept very hush-hush. Day 39. It was in my room. It's 3:13 a.m. and I just woke up feeling like someone was choking me. When I opened my eyes, it was the white shadow sitting on my chest with its fingers around my neck. I was barely able to get it off me, throwing it to the floor, and when I did, it just looked up at me like it was confused before disappearing. The thing literally just faded out of existence on my bedroom rug. I am too afraid to go back to sleep. I'm afraid to go to work tomorrow. I called Thomas, but he didn't answer. Day 43. I've never been more afraid than I was the other night, but today was a close second. I was in Miss Ann's room cleaning, and she started talking to me about when she was a young woman my age. I was only listening a little as I was trying to drown her out with a documentary on my phone, but she mentioned the Gettysburg Address. This got my interest, and I paid her more attention. Yes, I'd have to say seeing that great man on stage giving the address was one of the proudest moments of my life, Mrs. Ann said from beside the window. I froze, and instantly she gave me a small, low chuckle. This whole time I thought you weren't paying any attention to this old woman's ramblings, she said. Her face was so self-superior and smug that for a moment I relaxed, thinking she'd just said it to get my attention. I shook myself mentally, reminding myself that this was a mental ward for the elderly, and that meant she was mental too. You almost got me, Mrs. Ann, I said to her as I went back to work. I know you've been around a long time, but Lincoln was long before even your time. I looked up to give her a reassuring smile, only to notice how she looked. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought I was in the room of a 70-year-old woman with a lot of prime left in her golden years. Not a 103-year-old who'd been on the very doorstep of death a few weeks ago. She smiled back at me as my face dropped. You look like you've seen a ghost. I managed to whisper back, "Maybe I have." "Maybe you are," she said, like she was correcting me. I bolted out of that room as fast as I could and went home sick. I told my manager I was throwing up, and from how pale and sweaty I was, she believed me. Day 45. I started doing some research last night on a genealogy website. I typed in Anne's name and just started copying and pasting the information I found into a separate file. Get this. There was a woman with her name present at the Gettysburg Address. Some of the upper-class families who attended signed a registry and had their photos taken. I swear to God, the Anne in that photo looked like a younger version of the woman in the nursing home. Even that smug facial expression is similar. I forwarded the info to Thomas's email. I hope he gets back to me soon on it because I feel a little too crazy for my liking. Day 46. Thomas is dead. His brother found him on the floor of his apartment this morning. Someone broke in and strangled him to death a few days ago. There weren't any marks around his neck, but he definitely choked to death. I'm going to talk to Anne. There's something connecting her to all of this. Thomas was attacked the same night I was. There's got to be a correlation. Later, day 46. Anne is missing. No nurses saw her go because 5 of them dropped dead, and the others were too busy trying to revive them and call paramedics. I quit on the spot and walked out. There is no way I can step foot in there again. To occupy me, I went back to searching for more about Anne. Not only was she at the Gettysburg Address, but she was recorded as boarding both the Hindenburg and Titanic and surviving both. A census states that she was a woman in her 40s living with her husband in Philadelphia at the time George Washington became president. She was a nurse during the Revolutionary War. One of the oldest mentions of her was as a little girl at the Plymouth colony. But here's where I found discrepancies. Anne isn't listed with those who were on the Mayflower ship that brought the Plymouth colonists. She was recorded as an old woman on the ship that brought the Roanoke colonists. That colony was supposed to have vanished completely without any survivors, but somehow Anne is in the Plymouth colony without any questions being asked. One way of explaining it is that the original Anne from the Roanoke colony was able to survive in the wild until the Plymouth settlers came and found her. Maybe she had no recollection of what had happened to her and her people, and happened to somehow be pregnant with a daughter who took her mother's name. That daughter grew up and passed her name on to her own daughter, and so on until present day. Another way to explain it is that Anne, who is an elderly woman in her new colony, absorbed the life out of her people to become the young girl the Plymouth people found. She could have repeated this cycle for hundreds of years until she ended up at the nursing home where I work. By that time, she may have let herself get too close to death, and after falling into a coma, she began subconsciously sucking the life out of the coma patients who were the only prey weak enough for her to take. Going to the hospital would have been a perfect guise to take life force out of dozens of people without anyone being suspicious. I can't explain why she wasn't able to kill me, but could take out Thomas. I do know one thing. Anne is out there roaming somewhere in the world, free to take all the lives she needs to make herself unrecognizable to anyone looking for her. I'm absolutely terrified that she's going to come after me, that she knows I know what's going on, that I'm a loose thread in need of pulling. I've talked to my sister, and she's coming by tomorrow afternoon to help me get what little I own to move in with her a few towns away. I've told her everything that's happened. She's as freaked out as I am. Admittedly, she does believe in this kind of stuff more than I do, but at this point, I'm just glad anyone is willing to take me seriously. Stay safe, everyone. I'm giving up my pursuit of Anne, the whole mystery, and leaving everything about this behind. I suggest anyone reading this to do the same. I don't like being in my house anymore. Not since Dad and Sadie stopped being there. Now there's just Mrs. Stenson and Mama, and I don't want to be around either of them. So instead of going into the house, I stay in my treehouse. Dad had it special built so that it's just like a house, just up in a tree, and it has a trapdoor. It has a regular door too, but I like the trapdoor a lot better. I have a little sleeping pad and some beanbag furniture. Plus, Dad got me a little fridge and microwave and a little window unit that can be a heater or an air conditioner, depending on if it's summer or winter. I can pretty much live in there, and for the past few months, I kind of have been. I don't like going in the house because that's where Mama is. She never leaves her room, but I can smell her all over the place. She smells really bad. Like milk that's been on the counter for a couple days, but not long enough to be all solid. I don't know how she manages to get her icky smell all over the place when she doesn't ever get out of bed and Mrs. Stenson is there to clean the house and cook every day. Maybe it's a superpower or something. Weird superpower, but whatever. At least she has one. I don't have one. Maybe I don't have a superpower, but I do have my treehouse. Maybe I'm more like Batman, where I'm just a regular person with a really cool hideout. Dad set up a TV for me with a built-in DVD player, so I can watch my favorite shows without Mama getting grouchy. She hates my shows. I leave all my DVDs out in the treehouse now because she went on a rampage and threw out all of my anime after Aunt Nat died. She told me my shows are weird and my clothes are weird, so she threw my stuff out and yelled at me to be normal. Dad totally lost his mind on her when he came home and found out. Dad likes the same weird things I like. So does Sadie. Dad bought me my shows and more of my clothes that I like and told me to just keep things I like in my treehouse until he moves back home. He offered me to come live with him and Sadie at his new house, but I don't want to, so he isn't making me. My house kinda sucks right now, but I don't want to leave. I can just stay in my hideout until things get better. I'm making hot cocoa when the ghost comes up through the trapdoor and collapses on the floor. I don't scream though. Only shoujo girls scream, and I'm more of a shonen girl. I stare at it and think that this must be the start to my own anime where I get my superpowers to see ghosts. Maybe I'll be a paranormal detective or an exorcist. I look out the window to see if anyone is running towards the treehouse in case an exorcist is coming who I can go with and start my apprenticeship. No one's outside though. It's just me and the white ghost thing. That's a little disappointing, but it doesn't mean that no one is coming. Maybe I just need to give them a minute. The white thing is right in front of me suddenly. Its hands are on either side of my head and its face is pressed almost right against my nose. I'm scared frozen. For a long time, I'm just standing there with the white thing's cold hands over my ears, and I'm too afraid to move. I stand there for so long, I stop being afraid and start noticing things about it, like how it doesn't have a smell or shadows. The whole thing is just a really flat white. Even up close, I can't see anything but white. Maybe it is a shadow, I think to myself. A moment later, it lets me go and falls backward onto the floor. You're very sick, the white thing says. It has a lady voice. It doesn't have lips. I don't think so, I respond. My nose isn't running, and I always get a runny nose when I'm sick. Not that kind of sick, it says. You have a tumor in your head. It just hasn't made you very sick yet, so you haven't noticed. My face scrunches up, and I rub my forehead as if I can feel the tumor there, but of course I can't. It's just my forehead like normal. If you say so, I tell the thing. What are you? I'm a woman. A very, very old woman. I've been really sick myself and had a bad accident. What about you, sweetie? Who are you? The white thing answers. Oh, I'm Alicia. I used to live in that house over there, but I live in my treehouse now. But not forever. When Dad moves back, I'm gonna go live in the house again. The shadow lady looks over to the house. It's really big, and I bet she's wondering why I'd want to live in a treehouse instead of a nice big house. I decide to answer before she asks the question. My mama is in there, and she smells weird and doesn't like my stuff. Sometimes she throws my stuff away. Lately, she just stays in bed, but I like the treehouse better. I have my TV and snacks and stuff, so I don't really gotta go in the house, except to go to the bathroom and stuff, I say, flopping down into one of my beanbag chairs. The shadow lady nodded, but it was hard to tell with all the whiteness. Do you need some Dayquil? I ask. The shadow turns its head to me. What for? I shrug. You said you were sick for a long time. When I'm sick, I take Dayquil. Thank you, Alicia, but I'm not the kind of sick that Dayquil would help with. Hot cocoa? I offer. When I'm the kind of sick Dayquil doesn't help with, it's usually cocoa that does. The ghostly shadow chuckled a little. Thank you, dearie, but cocoa wouldn't help me either. Well, what would? Everything was quiet for a while. It was quiet for so long, I thought the shadow lady had gone to sleep or something. I need to eat people, the shadow said quietly. I'm too weak to hunt for them, though. I could probably bring some people here for you if you want, I offered. What kind of people do you usually eat? I don't usually eat people, sweetie. Just when I'm too sick. The best ones for me right now would be kids who are really overweight. Ew, fat kids don't sound yummy, I say with a scrunched face. I imagine what it would be like to eat a fat kid, and I think it'd be like chewing on the icky fat pieces on a steak. Remembering that rubbery feeling of the fat between my teeth kinda makes me gag. Maybe to you, the shadow admits, but for me they make me feel a lot better, so I like them. They have the most life and energy in them, which is what I need to get better. I'll need a lot of them, though. Are you sure you're okay with bringing them here to me? I nod to her. Yeah, there's a park not too far away. Lots of fat kids play over there. I could just go over there and ask them to come home for cookies, and I bet they'll come with me. You just gotta promise not to eat me instead. No worries, sweetie. You're too thin, and that tumor means you don't have enough life left for it to be worthwhile for me to take. You're safe enough for me, but I do need you to bring me another kid as soon as you can. I'm very weak. If you bring me enough to get better myself, I'll help you get better too. I'll be your best friend to show my gratitude for all your help. Alrighty, I say as I stand up and slip my shoes on. Stay here and I'll be right back. I go down through the trapdoor and head behind the tree where the walking trail is. It's part of the park where adults like to go running. Sometimes I even see teenagers at night walking around with cigarettes. I usually stay away from the trail because I don't really like going outside, and it always reminds me of my mom making me go on walks with her before she kept herself piled up in bed. It's not a very long walk, though. 5 minutes later, I'm at the playground, looking around, trying to figure out who the ghosts would want to eat more. There are a few chubby kids playing on the sides, but they're a lot bigger and a lot older than me, and I don't really want any trouble. Older kids always mean trouble. I spot someone over on the swings and think they look about right. They're my height, but weigh a lot more than me. I can't tell until I'm a lot closer that it's a girl. Hey, I say to her as I sit on the swing next to her. She doesn't look at me. Hi. Want some cookies? She looks at me like she doesn't believe me. Maybe she knows I'm not really going to give her cookies. Where do you have cookies? She asks. At my treehouse. I have a bunch of cookies and hot cocoa, I respond. My mama doesn't let me have that stuff anymore, the girl says, sadly, scuffing her shoes on the rubber safety mat. Is your mama here? I ask, looking around. I hadn't thought until now that it wouldn't be good for an adult to see us together. Mama sent me here to get some exercise. I'm supposed to be walking over on the running track, but it makes my feet hurt, she answered. Well, if she can't see it, she can't get mad about it. We could sneak over to my treehouse and eat cookies, and she won't even know it happened, I say, starting to move towards the walking trail. She doesn't look fully convinced yet. Actually, she looks kind of nervous. I don't know, she says, worried. I'm not supposed to go anywhere with strangers, and Mama will kill me if she finds out. The strangers thing is about adults. Kids aren't strangers. And how is your mom gonna know? Unless you tell her, she can't find out. I say in the most convincing way I can, moving a little further away. If you don't want to go, I guess that's fine. None of my business if you don't want cookies and cocoa. That got her. She pulls herself up and waddles along with me back to my treehouse. This time, the walk takes like 10 minutes because she walks so slow, but we eventually get there. She needs a minute to breathe before she can climb the steps up to the trapdoor. Once we're inside, I'm a little confused. I don't see the ghost anywhere. It's not like there's a lot of places to hide, so she has to be inside somewhere. What are you looking for? The other girl asks me, looking around the treehouse too. Nothing, I say, pretending that nothing's wrong. I walk over to the table with the microwave and start making cocoa. I'm starting to feel like the kind of sick where I could use some. The other girl sits down at my tea table, still looking around. I really like your treehouse. Thanks, I do too. My dad had it built for me. My dad doesn't do anything for me, she says, sounding kind of sad. He sits in his recliner and calls me fat a lot. Sometimes he tells me I'm never gonna be a real girl because I just look like a fat little boy. I didn't say anything to that because I was always told not to say something if I didn't have a nice thing to say, and definitely never lie. And it didn't seem nice to tell her dad was right about how she looked, and it would be a lie to tell her she didn't. Instead, I brought her a cup of cocoa over and grabbed a bag of cookies. We sat in the quiet for a while, just eating cookies and drinking the cocoa. I had pretty much decided I imagined the ghost lady by the time I saw her sneaking up behind the bigger girl. My whole face must have lit up because the girl looked at me kind of weird before turning her head to look behind her, just in time for the ghost lady's mouth to open up super wide and bite down on her whole top half. There was a whole lot of blood before the ghost chomped down on the other half of her lunch. Some of it even sprayed on me, and I got a little bit in my eye. My eyes immediately started watering like crazy, and by the time it stopped, the ghost was already done eating. She was wiping her hands over where the blood was, and when she moved her hands, the blood was gone. She did this over every bit of it on the table and floor until I didn't see any more anywhere. When she was done, she walked over to my big beanbag couch and flopped down onto it. Thank you, Alicia, she said really quietly. Anytime, I told her. Just let me know when you're hungry and I'll go get you another snack. My dress was ruined with all the blood splatters. My mom was still cooped up in the house, making it smell weird. Dad and Sadie were still living somewhere else. But none of that seemed to suck as much anymore. I had a new friend living with me, and for once I didn't feel like I was invisible to everyone. 12 people sat assembled around the huge oak table, none of them happy to be there. Jury duty was the last activity any of them wanted to participate in. Many of those gathered had jobs to be at or trips they wanted to take, but here they all were, bored, annoyed, and ready to go home. The door at the back of the room swung open, and a man in a dusty-looking gray suit came in with a cart meticulously organized with binders. He didn't say anything to the jury members as he handed them each a binder with copies of the case information in it. Not until he had placed the card against the wall and set up a projector connected to a computer on a desk did he bother to speak. My name is Marshall Collins, he introduced himself, his voice sounding dusty as well. His face seemed a little ashen, like he'd seen a lot of things recently to make him question his view of the world. He cleared his throat. As you all know, this is a very sensitive case. I understand everyone has been briefed already, but I want to reiterate that this is going to be very, very different from the type of case you may have been expecting. This information had everyone around the table sitting up a little straighter. We were told it was the case for all those kids who went missing, one woman in her mid-40s said quietly. Marshall nodded his head. That it is. Well, let's get this underway then, an older white man with a bulbous stomach and trucker hat bellowed. I want to convict the bastard child killer and get him on death row ASAP! You may want to save your enthusiasm for a few moments, Marshall sighed. Why? Any scumbag with enough evidence against them to start a trial over is guilty as shit, in my opinion. I don't even know why we're wasting time here looking at the proof instead of just voting him guilty and throwing his ass away, the overweight man stated, with his arms crossed over his chest and a scowl on his face. On top of that, a young black woman cut in quietly, why is all of this being kept so hush-hush? No news crews, no courtroom trial, no one from the public allowed to watch the proceedings? It's kind of weird, Mr. Collins. 12 faces questioned him at once. Some were openly curious, some confused, a couple looked a little hostile. With a sigh, Marshall clicked something on his computer, pulling up a picture of a young red-haired girl on the projector. The suspect is 8-year-old Alicia Lazarus. She was the last person seen with all 8 children who have gone missing in a 3-month period. Oh, that is a joke, the belligerent man said, sounding a little bit like a toddler on the edge of a tantrum as he shoved his folder away and stood up. I came here to work on a real case, not some nonsense about a little girl. Where the hell is the real culprit? Marshall clicked the computer again, bringing up a video to the screen. I can assure you this isn't a joke, sir. Unfortunately, this case is very serious, and before I present you with any evidence we have, I need to ask everyone to steady their nerves. This whole ordeal is going to be very taxing, confusing, and will take a lot of careful consideration on everyone's part. The belligerent man sat back down, making a show of getting comfortable in his chair with his arms crossed behind his head. The look on his face challenged Marshall to prove himself. Many of the others exchanged confused glances among themselves, but no one spoke up. Once everyone had settled in, Marshall cleared his throat. This case isn't going to be public. Everything needs to stay very quiet, and we need to get it worked out quickly on top of that, he stated. We owe the parents of those missing kids justice, but we also have to consider the fragile nature of our accused. The first bit of evidence I have for you is a compilation of video footage from a CCTV camera from R&R's barbecue across the street from the park where all the victims were last seen. In these videos, you can clearly see the accused walking alone with each victim in the direction of a jogging trail on the other side of the park. Marshall clicked a few times before the footage began playing. Each of the 7 separate videos showed a very clear picture of the little red-haired girl walking to the right with other children. In most of the scenes, she was only with one other child, but in one she was with 2 at a time. They would walk in from the left of frame, cross, and exit the right side of the camera view. None of the kids with her seemed nervous or scared. They looked like normal little kids heading off to walk the wooded trails that were popular for the joggers and families in town. These videos are some of the last known evidence of the victims and shows Miss Lazarus as the last person to see them all alive, Marshall informed the group. So, what? A young, maybe 19-year-old Asian man spoke up. Do we think she was luring them out to do something? The young black woman perked up. There's a bluff in the far back of those trails that overlooks where the creek curves towards the river. Maybe she pushed the kids off? Is the creek fast enough to wash the bodies away, though? A middle-aged, blonde white woman asked. I thought divers already went down there and didn't find anything. Marshall nodded to the theorists. Yes, divers have checked the creek. Teams have gone miles along the banks to search for any sign of the kids having been in the water. But no evidence has been found. There have been no remains found for reasons you will soon understand. Well, there was that flash flood in June, the belligerent man offered. That was right before the last kids, so maybe that washed the bodies out farther than they could search. As much as he disliked the man, Marshall had to keep himself from snapping at him. Police and search parties have been called off in light of recent evidence that you will be shown shortly. Just please be patient, Marshall replied. He clicked again and a new video file pulled up. This is the interrogation of Miss Lazarus, conducted by child psychiatrist Dr. Gulson with Officer Tallis sitting in. The video was a standard, boring shot typical of police interviews. There was the little girl, suggested to be a killer, seated at the table with a male psychiatrist seated across from her. "Alicia, I'm Dr. Gelson. I'm like the counselor from your school," the man said as an introduction. "I'm here to talk to you about some other kids you've met recently." Alicia sat in her chair, very still, and seemed to keep her eyes steadfastly on the doctor. "What about them?" "Well, to start, tell me how you met them," Mr. Gelson asked. The little girl didn't fidget the way a normal child would. She didn't swing her feet, play with her hair, twiddle her fingers, bite her nails. She didn't bashfully look away from the adult. Her body stayed eerily still, her gaze directed at her interrogator. "I met them at the park." "The park by your house?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." Her voice showed, even through the grainy audio quality of the police video, that she was not nervous. "How did you pick out which kids you wanted to play with?" "I didn't play with them. Most of them were smelly and gross, and I didn't really want to be around them. I picked the fat kids, though." "Why did you pick the overweight children?" Dr. Gelson questioned. "'Cause those ones fill her up best." The doctor was shown to pause for a full 5 seconds before noting her response. "What do you mean by fill her up?" "The fat kids are big enough to keep her from getting too hungry before I can feed her again," Alicia answered. It sounded almost as if she thought this was too obvious to have to explain. "Who were you feeding, Alicia? Is there an animal in the woods you were taking care of?" Dr. Gelson asked. Alicia shook her head. "No, she isn't an animal. There aren't any animals big enough to eat people on that trail, doctor. My parents said that there's nothing bigger than squirrels out there." "Who is she then, Alicia? Who were you feeding?" "There's a ghost lady from the woods where the trail gets close to my backyard. She likes to hide out in my treehouse. She's always hungry, and the only thing she eats is kids, because she's been sick for a long time and needs to get better. She was too sick to get them herself, so I would bring her kids to eat," Alicia answered. "Did the ghost lady threaten you into doing this? Did she say she would eat you if you didn't bring her other children?" Alicia shook her head, finally moving for the first time, cocking her head to the side. "I offered to bring them. I don't want her to go away, so I fed her. She promised to never eat me because I'm too little and sick to be good to eat." "What do you mean by that? Are you sick, Alicia?" Dr. Gelson questioned, shooting a glance at Officer Tullis for the first time the whole interview. "No one has told us that you aren't well." "Yeah, she says I've got this thing in my brain called a tumor," Alicia replied, pointing at a spot near the front of her head on the left side. "She said eating me would only get her a little bit of time, but that she would be my best friend and show me how to get better if I brought her enough kids to make her all better first." "Who is she, Alicia?" Dr. Gelson asked, leaning a little over the table with his fingers steepled. "She's just the lady in my treehouse. I don't know her name. Could you show us where the other kids are? The ones you took to her. Their parents really miss them and want them to come home," Dr. Gelson coaxed. The little girl shook her head. "They got eaten. There isn't anything left of them to go home. She ate them all up." "Could you introduce us to her? We would like to meet her and be friends with her too. I'm sure that if she really is sick, that she needs help, and we would love to get her the help she needs," Officer Tullis asked. His tone was fatherly, tender even. She shook her head. When she spoke again, her voice was cracking from the tears starting to roll down her pale, round cheeks. "I can't. She ran away after the last kid got away from her. I haven't seen her at all since then." The little girl pulled her legs up into the chair and buried her face into her knees. Her sobs were heart-wrenching to hear, even with the bad audio quality. The video ended, leaving the jurors very confused. "She's insane," the old, overweight man from earlier announced. "Open and shut case." "I think you're all insane. She's a little girl. There is no way a little girl can go killing people. She's simply not big enough to do any damage," the middle-aged woman said, objecting to the whole situation. What about the ghost person she said she was feeding the kids to? Has anyone searched for her? She seems to be the real culprit in this and just used little Alicia as a lure to get the other kids, the black woman questioned. The Asian man cut in. How about that treehouse? Anything going on with it? Marshall raised his hands to quieten the most talkative of them down. Yes, search parties have been looking for the ghost woman Alicia was talking about. She described the woman as a flat white lady shape without a face or hair. It's a bit hard to look for something like that, but it's suspected that it was a woman wearing one of those full-body morph suits. In regards to the treehouse, it has been scrutinized from top to bottom. Every nook, cranny, and splinter went over with a magnifying glass. There was plenty of evidence that DNA matched back to the children who went missing. Several of the adults before him looked ill. Evidence? The Asian man asked with a bit of a drawn tone. The gray man nodded. If you'll open your folders, you can see photos of what was found inside Alicia's treehouse. No one looked eager to open the binders. They exchanged glances, each seemingly waiting on someone else to go first. After a few moments of silence, the belligerent man huffed and threw the cover to his folder open. The others followed his lead to the detriment of a few of their better judgments. The first photo was of a small, white, round table with a tiny porcelain tea set. There were 2 small chairs on either side with cookies, water, and a little vase of faux flowers. It would have been cute if not for the huge, dark spray of long coagulated blood covering the pristine paint. The dirtiest side of the table was splattered, as if to suggest it had dripped from the mouth of someone eating too quickly. Many of the jurors' faces became confounded. No one said anything, which Marshall took as a blessing. He didn't want to talk about the case any more than required. This next picture is more graphic, and if anyone is squeamish, I highly suggest to steel yourselves. Marshall wasn't exaggerating. The next photo was an on-scene shot of a blender sitting on the floor. Scraps of dried, jerky-like flesh were visibly caught in the blades of the appliance. Dark, dried blood coating the plastic. It was immediately met with sickened noises from the jurors. That's foul, a woman who had stayed silent until then said, trying not to gag. This is evidence from a murder scene, Marshall said dully. You can't have been expecting candy and bunnies. The flesh has been tested and came back belonging to Margaret Collins, age 12, the 4th child to go missing. Maybe she cut the girl up first and tried to liquefy her, the young black woman offered. Her dark face looked to have paled a bit, and her voice had a tiny shiver to it. You don't think Alicia ate any of those kids herself, do you? The middle-aged woman questioned. She was a shade of pale green that hinted she may soon be sick. Feeling ill himself, Marshall replied, We can say for certain that she did. The only DNA found in the appliance was from Marshall Collins, indicating she was the only one to be used in it. You said there was evidence from all the kids in there earlier, the overweight man challenged. With a shake of his head, Marshall answered that challenge. Right, I did, but it wasn't all in the blender. There were traces of blood, hair, and a few fragments of bone discovered inside the treehouse that could be traced back to every child Alicia was seen leading away from the park. Are there more photos like this? The older man from earlier inquired after a long silence. He wasn't looking so pompous anymore. He didn't look too put off, but the edge he'd had earlier was gone. Yes, Marshall said apologetically. Can we skip anything else like this? The gory crap isn't settling well, the man spoke, the other people nodding their agreements. Marshall met eyes with the man. We're here to judge the case of this young girl, sir. We can't do her the dishonesty of leaving ourselves ignorant of any details. Is there any other evidence we can look at as a break, then? The younger black woman questioned. Marshall shook his head, moving the mouse around. Unfortunately, no. It just gets worse, I'm afraid. As it turns out, Adkin Lazarus had an entire slew of home security cameras installed in every room of his home, including his daughter's treehouse. There is video footage of what transpired with each and every child Alicia lured there, as well as her own cannibalistic attempts with Margaret Collins and the blender. The new video seemed to be set in an upper corner of the treehouse. It caught every part of the tiny room, but the table was best in view. From a little opening in the floor emerged Alicia and another little girl about her own age, but who was easily 30 pounds heavier. There was no audio, but clearly they were speaking. Alicia guided the other girl to the little white table and gestured to her to take a seat. No one seemed too disturbed by this. They watched Alicia sit down and pour water from the little teapot into her playmate's cup, offering a cookie and eating one herself. In the farthest corner of the room, a white form began to take shape. Alicia visibly brightened with excitement as the figure became more solid, though like a white shadow instead of a true thing. It straightened up to show a vaguely human form before making its way to the table. The chubby little girl seated opposite Alicia seemed to pick up on the change in attitude, her round face scrunching up in confusion. Just as she turned to look behind her, the white thing opened a mouth that gaped from its face to its pelvis and swallowed the little girl whole. The white shape stretched and wavered, blood drooling down its legs in tiny rivulets to splatter the floor as its entire body chewed and swallowed. Marshall turned the video off in disgust. He felt bile in the back of his throat and did his best to keep it down as he faced his shocked audience. Is anyone interested in seeing the other 8 videos from the Bevan security system at this time, or should we break for lunch and resume later? The case only took 2 days to come to a decision and issue the verdict of not guilty by reason of mental instability. There is little else they could feasibly do. Alicia's guilt was questionable in regards to her age, but there was no doubt that she willingly fed other children to their deaths, and took part in cannibalism and desecration of a corpse. They couldn't formally charge her due to her age, but no juror felt safe letting someone still potentially dangerous out among her peers. Alicia was sent to a children's psychiatric ward. She wouldn't be eligible for release until her 18th birthday. Her family was torn by the decision, but it was better than possibly setting her loose on more children. Many of those who had worked on the case required therapy once the whole ordeal was over. Marshall himself resigned from his position in pursuit of a more natural working environment. I was born in England during King Henry VIII's reign. I wasn't anyone important. Wasn't ever going to be either. All I was a little chambermaid who was lucky enough to stay out of the way of the royal family's many dramas. I had waited on Queen Catherine of Aragon, and while she was a nice woman, I was not overly taken with her. She did her duties as queen, did her best to care for her subjects, and was even a great pious woman. But if it had not been for her tragedy of a marriage, she would not have been memorable. In the years that followed, I was chambermaid to all subsequent queens. Anne Boleyn was a very interesting woman, and I would say that she was my favorite. She was light and dark, mysterious yet open as a book, and I found her enchanting in a way I could not put into words at that time, though now I would say I had a crush. Watching her head be sliced from her body was a difficulty that I've been fortunate to not experience again. Jane Seymour was little more than a young girl when she ascended and died. Anne of Cleves was a wonderful, clever woman, and I did enjoy her while she was in the castle. I was happy when she was divorced instead of beheaded. By the time the last 2 Catherines, Parr and Howard, came around, I was no longer interested in learning about my sovereign, so I regretfully did not learn anything of them. My life was fairly privileged. Living in the castle meant I was more likely to be fed regularly, have shelter, be out of the elements during winter. Until my 8th year of life, I was with my mother, a beggar and a prostitute who did her best to care for me, but was unable to do so. Many times in her care did I go days without food, find myself on the receiving end of one of her customers when she was deemed inadequate to sate their needs. worried I would freeze solid in the cold and snow when we could not find even a bit of shelter. My early upbringing made me value my low place among the wealthy nobility as if I were uplifted to heaven itself. The work may have been hard. I may still have been sexually accosted on occasion when a nobleman took an interest, but no longer did I fear I would die. Well, I did not, at least, until Queen Mary took her place at the throne. During her rule, she went on a rampage against her Protestant subjects. I was one of the first outed as a Protestant, having been an open practitioner my entire life. Up until that point, I had never felt it was dangerous, but very, very quickly I understood that mistake. Younger women who I worked with, who were looking to curry favor for themselves, were quick to turn me over to those in power. I was quickly locked in the tower with my fellows as we awaited our trials and eventual execution. While I was one of the early to be captured, I was not among those first sent to their fiery deaths. Day by day, I and my cellmates were forced to listen to the agonized screams of other Protestants as they shrieked out their last in the courtyard below our window. Some days I would stand and watch, both unable and unwilling to take my eyes away. I felt that it was my duty to watch, pray for their souls, and be sorrowful on their behalves against the multitudes who came to joyfully watch them burn. Deep in my soul there is a hate harbored for that self-righteous bitch that 400 years has done nothing to dampen. While I waited in my damp, rat and flea-infested cell for my fate, I became friends with another woman, much older than myself, who was an utter terror of what was to come. Each time a burning began, she would curl herself into a ball, whimpering and sobbing so hard I feared she would choke. I did my best to comfort her, although at most times it was impossible to tell if she could even sense my presence. One day, many weeks into our imprisonment, she woke me with a hard grip on my arm that startled me from what little sleep I was able to get.
"Anna, I cannot be burnt again,"
she whispered urgently. Her pale blue eyes were wide, filled with tears, bloodshot from her grief. "Mary, what do you mean again?" I questioned, my foggy brain doing its best to understand. Her face was pale as a ghost, her lips quivering as a child's would.
"I have a secret, Anna. It's kept me alive for a very long time, gotten me through many, many attempts on my life, but I'm so afraid now. I've been burned to bones and ash before, twice, and I'm too afraid to endure it again. I wish to die and be done with this awful world, but I can't do so until I've rid myself of this ability."
I was confused. I was fatigued from starvation, dehydration, and illness from the fleas and horrid conditions. What she said made no sense to me. "What are you talking about, Mary?" I queried. Mary grasped my face in both her hands. Her face pleaded with me to believe her. "A God gifted this to my own mother so long ago that Jesus himself had yet to bless us all with his sacrifice. An old God, deep in a grove, was so taken with her that it gifted her with the ability to live as long as he. But it comes at the price of taking those extra years from others. My mother gave me her power when my father died, and she could not go on without him. I was born in 1202, Anna. I have lived so long, but my mother lived so much longer. I cannot die unless I give this power to another person, lest it revive me. Please, take this burden from me and set me free, Anna." There was a fever ravaging my brain, and in my delirium, I simply nodded my head, unsure of what was truly going on. Her relief was instant. Mary threw her arms around me and sobbed her thanks into my shoulder. She praised me for my bravery and kindness to take her place. I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. Mary leaned back, wiped her eyes, and thanked me one last time before a thick white smoke erupted from her mouth, nose, and eyes. I went to scream, and the smoke dove into my open mouth and down my throat. I felt a cold wash through every molecule of my body. My veins felt as if there was liquid ice flowing through them. My skin went numb. A light fog seemed to waft off me in the cold air of my cell, and I wondered if this was God smiting me for accepting witchcraft into my body. Moments later, I became cognizant of the terrified shrieks of my other cellmates. I had lost all awareness in those strange moments while my possession occurred, forgotten that other people shared this dank little space with me, forgotten that this would look much worse than simple Protestant beliefs to anyone who saw what just happened. Guards burst into the cell to deduce the cause of so much commotion. They spotted the pile of dust that remained of my friend, heard all the accusations of witchcraft from my fellow inmates, and took no time at all to lever their judgment on me. I was instantly grabbed in their rough hands and hauled out of the tower to the burning grounds. I had not yet recovered from the shock to my system. My skin burned with cold, my whole being racked with shivers that I could not control. There was no strength in my body with which to even try to defend myself. I was stripped bare before the crowd of jeering peasants. Iron shackles bound me to a boulder scorched black and still scalding hot against my back from recent use. I could hear the guards declaring me a witch to the crowd. They explained how special a treat it was for them to be witnessing my execution. Bile sprayed from my mouth, stomach churning in terror as they piled wood around me. Foul, chunky fluid was poured over my legs, the smell causing me to vomit again. I realized quickly that it was liquefied, putrid pig fat, meant to make me burn all the better, but not in an efficient manner. My eyes met those of my executioner. He gave me a self-satisfied smirk before touching the flame of his torch to my greased feet. The agony I experienced was the likes of which hell is made of. I was not one of the fortunate who went unconscious from fear. In fact, I believe I was sent into a state of hyper-awareness that made me so much more sensitive to all the sensations that ran through me. I wish I could say that I had the presence of mind to pray for help, but in all truth, my brain could not have formed a coherent word, let alone a full thought. The flames raced up from my feet to my hips. It burned there for a long time, so long that I was able to watch them blacken, char, see my own bones become visible through my ruined flesh. Only when my captors deemed it appropriate did they douse my upper half in more stinking fat and push the wood close to ensure a thorough burn. At long last my brain could handle no more. I awoke in a state of panic so severe I barely remember the details. All I recall was that everything looked enormous and tall, that my back was being burned and my wrists hurt. I was easily able to slip my hands from the huge shackles and ran as hard as I could away from what burned me. I must have run for an hour before my adrenaline gave out. My whole body shut down at once, sending me sprawling to the ground. My consciousness abandoned me for the second time that day. As it turned out, I had collapsed in the field of a farming family who found me not long after I fainted. I soon realized that I had been reverted to no more than a 3-year-old child, and as such was able to go undetected by anyone who may have still been on my witch hunt. The farmers who found me were kind enough to take me in and raise me along with their other 4 children. They were in constant awe of my maturity, but believed it must have been an act of God. I was fortunate that they were too simple to question how a young child was gifted with the knowledge and skills of an adult. I eventually learned that all those present at my execution disappeared. There was no trace of the crowd, the guards, or the witch. It was quickly swept under the rug and forbidden to be spoken of. What actually happened is that the ability Mary gifted to me had activated upon my death so violently that it sucked not only the life force out of those nearby, but also absorbed their bodies as well. It was enough to fully heal me and revert me to such a young age, giving me the perfect escape and alibi. While there were search parties for a while looking for me, no one suspected a 3-year-old child of any mischief. I slowly grew up with my new family, learning the ways of a farm and what it was like to be in a family. When I initially grew up, I was an only child to a destitute whore and a housekeeper in a huge castle. No one took any true care of me. Now there was always someone to talk to, spend time with, someone to help when I needed assistance. When I was old enough, I was married to the middle son of another farmer. We had no children, despite trying hard. I've learned since that it was because I was born without a uterus of all things. I was fortunate that he was a good man. He did not have the pressure of his older brother to create an heir, thus it did not really bother him to be married to a barren wife. We lived as we pleased, and when we caught wind of a plan to cross the great sea to a new continent and establish a settlement, we were both excited at the prospect. We had grown tired of the constant turmoil caused by changing monarchs, the rampant diseases that ravaged every year, and yearned for our religious freedoms. At that time, I still held a tentative grasp to my religious convictions and was terrified to be prosecuted for it again. So, when a friend brought up to us that there was an expedition looking for volunteers to settle the new country, I was immediately ready to go. Regretfully, this was one of my most egregious mistakes. In 1584, we were abandoned by Sir Richard Greenville, our leader and captain, under the guise of going back to England to resupply. I cannot say for sure if that was his intention, but I do know that we were left to our own devices for 3 years in an unfamiliar land full of natives who were none too happy to have us. I was the only woman out of 108 people, and quickly took my place as chef and nurse while the men did their best to build us all homes, find food, try to farm this new world. We were able to build a fort, but anything we hoped to accomplish was hard won from the hostile natives that we seemed to fight endlessly with. By the time Sir Francis Drake came and offered to take us back to England, many of our number were eager to go, and they did, leaving only 50 of us who wanted to keep trying to carve out a home. We eked out a meager existence, but soon came to pass that we should have taken our chance to go home. That winter was horrid. Many fell sick, and it was my duty to tend them all. We were starving, freezing, and dying. I myself was befallen with the illness frequently, but would take the life of another sick person already near death to heal myself to keep going. I rationalized that without me, everyone would die. By taking only what I needed to continue caring for those who could still be saved, I was doing more good than I was bad. As shameful as I found it at the time, we ate the bodies of our fallen friends. There was nothing else to eat, nothing to nourish us through that awful winter. We went so far as to grind the bones to dust and make soup with them. No remains were left of our unfortunate fallen. I'm not sure how, but the men became suspicious of my resilience to the illness plaguing us. They surmised that it must be my doing, seeing as I was healthy, and was always the last to see them alive, always the one to announce the death to the others. They banded together against me. It was their idea to kill me, make a sacrifice of me to appease God for having harbored a murderess and a possible witch in their midst. My poor, dear husband did his best to defend me, but they quickly dispatched of him. They clubbed him in the head until he stopped moving before turning their attention on me. I was furious. I had loved that silly old fool of a man, had done my best to care for these heathenish, beastly excuses of men, and this was what I was given in repayment, a bludgeoned husband and an accusation of evil. I held back nothing in absorbing them body and soul. This reverted me to just a young woman again, though this time I was more in the age of 15 years old. With a broken heart, I buried my husband as best I could. Months later, 115 more colonists led by John White arrived in search of those who had been left by Greenville. They were shocked to find me, but took my explanation of being the only survivor from a shipwreck who had found her way to this fort. I told them I did not have family back in England, and they decided to let me stay there in the settlement. I had a little living quarter of my own behind the kitchen, and was tasked with helping the older women with cooking and caring for the many people in our new colony. Many people avoided me out of trepidation, and at that point I was perfectly fine with being on my own. The repeat of events from our first colony was so eerily similar that I wondered if it were even possible to make a home out of this god-forsaken country. The natives killed us any time they caught us outside our fort walls. The stores of food the new colonists brought was quickly being depleted, and winter was coming fast. We hoped daily for the return of Captain White, who had followed in Greenville's footsteps, returning to England for supplies. We did not see him that winter, nor the next. By the winter of 1589, there was barely anyone left. Again, we had resorted to cannibalism, eating anyone who died, grinding the bones to use as soup when there was no flesh to consume. I had gone back to my method of taking the lives of anyone close to death whom I could get alone with. This time it was much more difficult. These people had family. Many slept together in piles for warmth. I was barely able to sustain myself from them as sickness spread. Eventually, our numbers dwindled down to only 20 or so weak and starving souls. I thought it a blessing one night, deep in winter, to absorb all those who remained. It was enough to cure my illness, revert me to a young girl again, and sated me until spring came. When the warm weather returned, I staged evidence in the settlement to look as though everyone had simply vanished. I carved the word Croatoan into a fence to insinuate that the colonists had moved to that nearby island. During my wait for the return of Captain White, I managed to make a decent living for myself along the coast. I became an accomplished fisher and hunter, built myself a tiny shelter, and began making preparations to live through another perilous winter. When I spotted the captain's ship anchored in the bay, I wasted no time in swimming out and stowing myself away on board. I was thoroughly sick of that new world and longed for the familiarity of home. I never imagined I would leave my beloved England again, but that was not to be. My next husband dragged me back across the ocean to the Plymouth colony once it was shown to be successful. Things at home had deteriorated to a degree that warranted the move, but I was not happy to do it. Luckily, this was a much more fruitful endeavor. We didn't face as many hardships as I did in the Roanoke settlement, for which I was eternally grateful. Over the years, I grew old, became young again, would remarry and disappear as I saw fit. Only twice did I allow myself to be turned back into a young child again to grow up. This plan worked well for me for a very long time. Not until I had a stroke in my 83-year-old current body did I discover any issues. I had been nearing death again, this time by age instead of illness, and had been planning how to go about regressing. I knew that, with how the government kept track of everyone, it would be difficult to just be a young woman without raising some sort of suspicions. I rationalized that it would be best to revert to a child, maybe 9 or 10, and let the government make me a new identity. After my stroke, I found that I was fully paralyzed. Something had happened to bury me in a waking coma. I was cognizant of the world beyond my body, but unable to interact with it. I tried to take in other lives, but it seemed not to help. I was sent to a nursing home on hospice care. The medical staff expected me to die any day, but I was not so willing. I sent my power out to collect life from the other elderly people close to death. They were the only ones weak enough for my decrepit self to drain. Anyone healthy, although the most beneficial, was simply out of my reach. This went on for a few years, but I came to the conclusion that nothing I did could snap me out of this coma. No amount of other lives could give me control back of my body. Taking years from others was only serving to prolong my own suffering in that immobile hell. All the strange, sudden deaths had garnered attention from the more curious workers, some having seen the white projection of myself as I went about my business. I heard them telling tales to each other about a ghost roaming the halls who attacked poor old people and killed them. I gave up, resigned myself to my fate, stopped taking lives, and let myself age into death. Near the end, the staff of the nursing facility saw fit to send me to the hospital to finish dying. I was made comfortable in a coma ward and left to myself. A kind nurse sat with me the night my heartbeat became irregular. I hate to admit this, but I was terrified as I began counting the beats. They were getting further and further apart. I was not yet ready to go. Maybe it was that ability that Mary had given me all those years ago that pushed me so hard to want to survive. Maybe it was just my own survival instincts. When my body finally gave out, that ability rushed out in every direction. I only knew it had done its duty when I awoke minutes later with the ability to move again. Gratefully, I sat up, eyes open for the first time in years. I had drained the lives of many other coma patients, and it had restored my movement. That was the best I had felt in many, many years. I was desperate to live again, desperate to be a young woman without a decrepit body full of pain and weakness. Unfortunately, I was not yet strong enough to take in younger lives. I had to content myself with other elderly when I returned to the nursing home. Biding my time proved more annoying than I anticipated. While I picked my marks and gained energy, I began messing with the little housekeeper who was so suspicious of me. I knew she was nervous around me, and I felt vindictive towards her. She was young, pretty, and clearly intelligent to have caught on to me. I teased her, tried to frighten her, and generally wanted to selfishly make her suffer. I tried to take her one night. I sent my ability out to find her and did my best to kill her. I didn't want to absorb her. I didn't want her life to be responsible for sustaining me. In my dislike for her, I simply wanted her dead. She woke up as I was strangling her, and she somehow was able to throw my ghost form off of her. Enraged, I went after her little boyfriend, the CNA who was working with her to collect evidence about the haunting at the nursing home. With rage as fuel, I strangled him in his bed. I didn't even bother to take any of his energy. I knew then that I was on a time limit. The housekeeper was wise to me. She knew it had been me who tried to kill her and had succeeded in killing the boy. I would need to act quickly because of that, and also because my rejuvenation was causing a stir among staff. People were getting antsy around me. I put all my strength into a massive attack that left 5 healthy nurses dead on the floor. The face that looked back at me from the mirror as I rushed to get redressed was that of a young woman, maybe 18 or 19 at oldest. I couldn't keep the smile off my face. I quickly brushed out my hair, got dressed in a skirt, button-down shirt, and a big soft sweater. The getup wasn't age-appropriate by any means, but it did what it needed to do. I was able to slip out of the nursing facility amid the chaos of medical staff rushing to revive the nurses and keep onlookers at bay. I chuckled to myself as I passed all that commotion. My first stop was the ATM. I withdrew all the money I could, and once I was comfortable with the cash, I began my trek to an old friend's house. Using my renewed legs felt amazing. It made me want to take the longer route to his house. This took me to the park where a trail led into the woods behind my friend's house. The excitement had clouded my senses, made me oblivious to everything around me. The mugger had shot me through the head before I even registered he had stepped out of the bushes behind me. He must have seen my enormous purse and assumed, albeit correctly, that I must have had something of value. The injury reduced me to nothing more than my ghostly form, and I was even weaker than I had been in the hospital. I don't even know what became of my physical body. It may have still been there on the pavement path, bleeding out, or just obliterated into only energy. I know that the thief got away with my bag, all my money and ID, and everything I had left. Somehow I dragged myself to the nearest shelter, which ended up being a little girl's treehouse. The little girl who owned it, Alicia, became invaluable to me in the coming weeks. She was desperate for contact, any form of friendship, and was willing to do anything to make that happen. It took nothing to convince her to bring me children to consume. She never questioned it other than just basic curiosity for why I specifically wanted them. She was cute. She was useful. I'm sorry she took the fall for my needs. I was on the verge of having enough energy to regain my human form when the police began investigating. I fled the treehouse as soon as I saw the police cars pull up in front of the house. Luckily, I was able to accost a few people on the trail, gaining just enough energy to become a person again before making it to my friend's home. Lucian, the friend, was confused when he saw me on his back porch. He was even more confused when I gave him our code. He rushed me into the house and into a spare set of clothes while grilling me on what had happened. I explained everything to him from start to end. He listened to the entire story with a look on his face that showed he believed me, but was having to reevaluate his entire belief structure. "Can you get me out of the country?" I asked. "I'm so done with this place." At that moment, I understood just how badly I wanted to go home. I missed England. I missed the farm country. I thought back all those years and felt such a yearning for that family who had taken me in, who raised me, and wished so badly that I could go back to that time and see them. They were hundreds of years in their graves, and I just wanted to go home to their little one-room cottage with its dirt floor and straw-stuffed mattresses. For a few minutes, I even considered giving away the ability that kept me alive and wither into dust like Mary had. This morbidity lasted only a little while. My survival instinct was too strong to simply give out. I stayed with Lucian while he got everything ready to get me smuggled out of the country. He set me up with a brand new British identity, complete with a visa stating I had been in the US for work-related travel. Lucian managed to get me work with a friend he had over in London in a museum when I arrived. For the last 6 months I have been in my homeland, feeling better than I have since the 1600s. I love working in the museum more than I anticipated as well. All day I help to manage the historical accuracy of a tiny village from my own time that hosts tours and a taste of the old ways. I personally oversee at least one tour per day through the small cottages, but some days I abandon my desk and do all 3 daily tours. Dressed in period-appropriate attire, I recount to my audience what life was like in the 1500s. I teach of disease, hunger, desperation, freezing, persecution, but I also relate the joy of community life, how it felt to sit with family every meal around a table full of food you grew and slaughtered yourself, not having the distractions of the modern era. I live in a small cabin on site. It's just a simple little setup with an open floor plan, very similar to the period-accurate ones, but with electricity and plumbing. This tiny cabin is the most at home I've felt in a very long time. Recently, I have also become acquainted with a funny man who visited the museum. He introduced himself as Mike, though he doesn't respond to it quite as fast as you would expect, as if it's a nickname he gave himself recently to distance himself from his former life. Mike has an American accent, no touch of the British to it at all, so I don't believe he's been here long, though he does live in the little town nearby. He's been a great companion to me, with his amiable demeanor, witty jokes, love of history, and sort of a soft appearance. I find myself drawn to him. Still, there is a cloud over him. I'm not sure what it could be, but it seems very dark, very serious. He doesn't let on much, though. I assume something must have happened to him in America, something that caused his relocation to another country. Regardless, I am comfortable with him and am happy with the way our dynamic is working out. At this point, I believe I can safely say I am happy. I'm at peace. For me, this is enough to make the suffering of my past worthwhile, and the possible suffering of my future worth getting to.
Halloween was bittersweet. It was Alicia's favorite holiday, as it meant she could wear any costume she wanted without hearing the complaints from her mother. Got to go out gathering candy, got to watch all the scary shows that flooded Netflix until she was asleep in a pile of goodies. This was the first year in many that Adkin was without his spooky little sidekick. This year, she was in the ground in a cemetery, her body decomposing into the satin upholstery of an overpriced box. Adkin has spent his morning sobbing into his hands in front of his daughter's headstone until he had cried himself out. He had never wanted to be a parent until it had happened. For a long time, he was just infatuated with how small she was, how big her eyes were, how she looked just like him. She never looked like her mother, had never been anything like the old bitch at all. She had taken after him in every way. They had spent so many hours together watching anime, picking out cosplay outfits, going to conventions, and in his workshop as he taught her how he made props. They had so many things left to do together and would never get to do any of it. Adkin wondered if things would have been better if he had never left. Would she still have done what she did if he had stayed in the house? He couldn't stop thinking through scenarios where he had kicked Miranda out of the house and filed for divorce instead of trying to outweight her. In retrospect, he didn't understand what he was thinking. Once he was sufficiently numbed by his cemetery experience, Adkin had driven to the store and bought as much candy as he could fit into a handbasket. If his own daughter wasn't going to enjoy her favorite holiday, Adkin was going to do his best to make sure other children did. The festivities started early for Adkin. He had taken the day off of work and was slowly making his way through a bottle of salted caramel whiskey while watching a Stephen King movie marathon. He had taken the day off work and was slowly making his way through a bottle of salted caramel whiskey while watching a Stephen King movie marathon, when the smaller children started trick-or-treating in the early afternoon. Cujo was playing when he took the last sip from his bottle. The alcohol had warmed his insides enough to allow him to think of his daughter without dissolving into a sobbing puddle again. Watching the rabid dog on the screen reminded him of Alicia's phobia of dogs after a near catastrophe when she was small. They had been at his own father's ranch when a neighbor's huge German shepherd came out of nowhere chasing a rabbit and collided with a tiny toddler Alicia. The accident had shoved her against an old shed, the weight of the dog causing her back to be impaled on a long rusted nail. The nail had pierced her left lung and caused an infection so extreme she had nearly died. Alicia spent a month in the hospital recovering from the accident, and by the time she was released, she was so afraid of dogs she couldn't even watch cartoon dogs anymore. He was deep in his memory when the doorbell rang again. Adkins stood from the couch, a little unbalanced from the whiskey, but he had no trouble making his way to the door. He swung it open without looking at the kid as he reached to the side for the big bowl. He was just turning his eyes to greet the kid when a loud bark issued from the massive, slightly blurry animal jumping on his doorstep. The bowl fell from Adkins' grip, the world seeming to move slowly as he reached for the gun he kept next to the door for protection against break-ins. All he could think of was how afraid of dogs Alicia was, how this one was enormous, how threatening the barking was, how it was jumping so close to him as if trying to attack. He didn't think as he leveled the barrel at the beast and pulled the trigger.
Bailey had spent all day jumping up and down in anticipation for trick-or-treating. This was the first year his mother was agreeing to let him go, and he was nearly falling over himself with the excitement. At 6 years old, Bailey was a few years late to the Halloween party. For the past couple years in school, he was so jealous of the other kids getting to go out and have fun gathering candy for the night while he just sat at home with candy his parents bought for him. This year, he was being allowed to go out knocking on doors begging for candy. He'd been too late picking out a costume, and was stuck with a boring dog suit, but wasn't about to let that upset him. He consoled his mildly hurt ego with the thought that it was a very realistic costume with beautiful, long golden fur and brown glassy eyes that all closely resembled a golden retriever. At 4 p.m., Bailey's mother handed him a little orange pumpkin pail. "I'm going to be right with you the whole time, so don't try to run off," she said as she snapped pictures of him posing in his costume. "We're only going around the neighborhood, too. I don't want to be out late or go too far." Bailey nodded and agreed, not caring that it wasn't going to be a big trip. All he cared about was getting to go at all. As soon as his mother opened the door, he ran out into the darkening afternoon with all the enthusiasm a small boy could hold. The first few houses were everything he'd dreamed of. Older women and kids commenting how cute his costume was and giving him big handfuls of candy. His mother was lagging a little further behind now, having relaxed a bit. Her phone rang, distracting her further. "You can go up to the next house alone, but I'll be here on the sidewalk," his mother said to him before answering her call. Bailey swung open the little white gate excitedly, bounding his way up the little path leading to the door. He reached up to ring the doorbell. After a few moments, a man in his early 30s answered the door in a button-up shirt and slacks, looking more like he was going to a nice dinner than to pass out candy. "Happy Halloween," the man said, not looking at Bailey as he reached to the side for his candy bowl. He had a kind of wobbly look about him, and Bailey could smell something that reminded him of how mouthwash made his nose feel. Bailey didn't care about any of that, though. He held his pail eagerly, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Trick or treat!" he proclaimed while hitting the button to make his costume bark. The man's face blanched immediately and twisted repulsively. He threw the bowl on the porch. His hand darted back inside the door, pulling back a hunting rifle that he leveled directly at Bailey. For a moment, Bailey was frozen. He wasn't sure if this was a Halloween trick. He opened his mouth to ask if the man was okay, and as soon as he began to speak, the man fired. Bailey's mother was a screaming, hysterical mess on the sidewalk as the paramedics carted the headless corpse of her son to the ambulance. The police were trying to get her husband by phone, or even find out where she lived, but she was inconsolable. While the paramedics began administering shock treatments to Bailey's mother, the police were trying to talk to the shooter. "It was a huge dog right on my doorstep," the man, now identified as Adkin Lazarus, insisted. He refused to admit, or simply had no idea, that he had just murdered a 6-year-old boy on his front porch. "I'm serious. It was standing on its hind legs with some poor kid's Halloween bag in its teeth trying to jump at me." "Sir, there was no dog. You shot a little boy in a dog costume who came up to your door to trick or treat," one of the policemen reiterated for the 3rd time. Adkin became furious. He stood to his feet, making himself bigger in an intimidating way. "I'm telling you, it was just that woman's hostile dog, not a little boy. She was just standing out there on the sidewalk letting her mutt run around without a leash. It could have gone off and attacked any of the kids who were out here. If anything, someone should be thanking me for keeping their kids safe." Another police officer stepped up behind Adkin to cuff him. "Sir, you are under arrest for the murder of Bailey Perkins. You have the right to remain silent, and if you cannot afford an attorney, you will be appointed one by the court." It took both officers to haul the struggling Atkin to a waiting patrol car as he screamed that all he had killed was a rabid dog. "7 years ago, my sister and her boyfriend were murdered by her husband after he found out about the affair. He buried them in a shallow grave in the backyard with just a foot of dirt covering the coffin. Sometimes I wonder what Travis thought when he broke the lid and dirt poured in on him. He must have thought they were deep underground and trapped when, in reality, they could have dug themselves out so easily. Michael may have buried them still breathing, but he knew how bad Nat's phobia was. He knew as soon as she woke up, she would go into a panic. There's not a doubt in my mind that he thought she'd end up killing Travis in a blind fright when her claustrophobia set in. I kinda wonder if he originally planned to dig her out when he felt she was sufficiently punished. I guess it's kind of ironic then that Travis strangled her and snapped her neck in that grave. Maybe after Travis killed her, Michael decided to just seal him up. The police are still looking for him. 6 years without even a trace found yet. I have to give it to him. I never expected the doughy prick to be so cunning. Well, I also never suspected he had the spine to murder either, but it's pretty obvious how wrong I was about him now. One of the detectives, Mindy, confessed to me not long ago that they had lost hope in ever finding him without him just blatantly giving himself up. Just extra insult on top of injury at this point. His letter to me started off as only a jump start to my panic. It's what led to the discovery of Natasha and Travis, but it also put a lot of the shittier parts of my life into perspective. To be told so blatantly that I was an awful parent, spouse, and person hurt. It hurt more because all of his points were things I'd already known. Hearing it from an outside source just brought it all home. Since Alicia was born, my marriage had been in decline. In fact, we got pregnant in the first place to save our marriage. Obviously, that didn't work. All Alicia did was put more unnecessary burden on us both. Our relationship had degraded into a sham, and even my goody-goody brother-in-law with his useless dick could see it. As much as I hate to admit it, he was right about how I felt about my daughter, too. Alicia was a strong-willed girl, which clashed with my own personality. I wanted to be able to dress her up in cute, trendy clothes, but all she wanted to wear were dresses that made her look like a creepy doll. The frills and bows and cutesy stuff were fine when she was 4, but at 7, it started to creep me out a bit. She refused to go on walks and hikes with me, didn't want to do anything outdoors. I was an avid camper and hiker and wanted to do those things with her, but she hated anything that involved going into the wilderness. I couldn't even persuade her to go walking on the trail behind the house. That's not to say I didn't love Alicia, but I wasn't close to her either. I could see long years ahead of me full of a weird teenager and eventually a stranger for an adult child who would probably disown me. It always rubbed me a bit raw that she was so close to her father. They loved to go on outings and weekend trips to conventions full of freaks dressed up as video game characters. He filled her closet with those weird doll dresses and bought her costumes from her favorite shows. Adkin indulged her in all her strange pastimes. So did the babysitter. Sadie was into a bunch of the Japanese cartoons that Alicia liked. They would sit for hours together watching the shows in Japanese with subtitles on, and Sadie was even teaching my daughter the other language. I thought it was all ridiculousness, since there wasn't any reason to learn Japanese when she was never going to go there. I'd already started looking into good programs and future careers to get her involved in as soon as she was old enough. I knew something was up when Adkins started taking Sadie with them on trips to those conventions. It wasn't long after that he started claiming to be working late, but coming home smelling like Sadie's fruity body spray. I didn't even bother to mention it for the useless arguments it would cause. I just internalized it that we would eventually divorce due to his infidelity. I'd get the house in Alicia, and he would pay me a bunch in child support, and I'd just relax on the front deck with a mimosa every day. Then my sister was murdered, and my whole life started falling to shit. I had to plan a funeral for my sister while wallowing in a depression so deep I literally couldn't breathe sometimes. I felt like I was drowning most days. More often, I couldn't even get myself out of bed unless it was to sit in the bathtub for hours scalding myself in the hot water. Michael's insults about my hygiene and lack of femininity revolved around my brain on a loop. And despite desperately wanting to shave, do my hair and makeup, get dressed up, clean the house, I just couldn't. I felt too heavy to lift myself. I canceled the yoga class I taught more and more until I quit working entirely. I just couldn't force myself to leave my bedroom. Adkins started having the babysitter stay overnights. He paid her more and more, asking her to start cleaning, doing laundry, driving Alicia to and from school, cooking, etc., while I lay in my room. That little 18-year-old girl stepped into the role of mother and wife while I became nothing. My husband didn't even check in on me anymore. He never came into the bedroom to sleep anymore. The only contact I had was Sadie when she came in to leave food that I rarely ate or clean up my messes. My own daughter didn't even come in anymore. I remember hearing her distant voice from the living room stating she didn't want to go into my room because I smelled bad and it was too dark. It wasn't long before Alicia told me he was moving out. He had gotten himself a nice apartment and he and Sadie were going to live there because she had started school full-time and couldn't work anymore. He wanted to support her while she bettered herself to become some illustrator or something. I don't really remember. I just know he didn't want to be with me anymore. Sadie shared his interests and wore the clothes he liked. She was clean, young, pretty, and made him feel better than I ever had. He had hired someone else to come take care of Alicia and the house, but I was on my own. He wasn't going to make someone take care of me when I wouldn't even take care of myself. I asked him when I should expect divorce papers, and he scoffed at me. He wasn't going to divorce me. He knew that he wouldn't get custody of Alicia with how the court system worked. The child support would eat him alive. It was cheaper for him to pay for the housing and utility costs of 2 households than to get 60% of his income bled out in child support every month. The best approach, in his opinion, was for him and his little slut to get their own place, get someone to take care of Alicia in the house so she could stay in her home, and wait for me to die on my own. He even told me he already had my funeral paid for, so that as soon as I was dead, he could get on with Sadie taking my place. Sounder logic I have never heard. Sarcasm. He came by to see Alicia every few days and called her every night to make sure she was doing well. Without fail, he was there to pick her up on Friday night and dropped her back off Saturday evening. She didn't want for anything. I can't fault him or say he didn't do his fatherly duties. I even understood why he didn't move her into his new place. She had always lived in our house, and the move would be hard on her. It would have been harder than just staying put until I eventually killed myself. The only problem was that I wasn't suicidal. I never have been. I didn't want to die or kill myself. I just didn't want to exist. Life went on in a gray blur for a few months. I don't remember much since everything just bled together into one long, eternal moment. After Adkins' discussion with me, the next thing I remember clearly was when the police came knocking on my door. While officers and detectives tore my house apart, I was briefed on the ridiculous notion that my 8-year-old daughter was a murder suspect. I laughed out loud, laughed in the detective's face, laughed until I was doubled over sobbing. I was delirious and lightheaded. I didn't believe a word they said until I took them to see the security footage of her treehouse and watched with them as the recordings of my little girl feeding other kids to a ghost proved me wrong. When I saw her dismember a girl's bitten off arm and blend it up to eat herself, I fainted. In my daughter's treehouse, the police found so much blood, so much hair, tiny bits of bone. I don't know how no one ever noticed it. Well, yeah, I do. I hadn't left my room in 10 months, and her father hadn't been farther into the house than the foyer in at least 6 months. They took her. They tried and sentenced her, all without the public ever being allowed in. Mindy told me it was to keep her reputation clear for when she was released. But I suspect it was more because the evidence was so crazy. They didn't want to have to explain to regular people what the fuck had happened because they weren't even sure themselves. I couldn't even find it within me to blame them. Alicia was sent to a children's mental hospital with a release date for her 18th birthday. She will never be let out, though. We found out not long after her incarceration that there was a tumor in her frontal lobe. She had mentioned it during her interrogation that her ghost friend had said she had a tumor in the front of her head. Imagine the shock when we all learned that she was right. The mass was inoperable, growing, and the prognosis was bleak at best. Alicia's tumor caused her to become extremely violent to anyone and anything near her, and she had to be put in isolation. She was in a tiny, padded isolation cell for 23 hours a day, every day, for many months. Being totally alone and mentally unstable does something to a person so young. She sat on the bed with her back against the wall, staring out into space without any expression. I don't know what she was thinking. She wouldn't speak to anyone. She didn't react to anything. No one knows if it was her mental illness or the out-of-control cells growing in her head. Maybe her state was due to the realization that her ghost was never coming back. Alicia passed away 7 months into her sentence. Adkin moved back in with me after the funeral. Sadie left him when he went into his own descent of depression. She could handle his daughter being a crazed cannibal, but his extreme mourning was too much for her. All his money and connections weren't enough to keep her interest in a 45-year-old man with crippled emotions, a broken wife, and a deceased insane murderer for a daughter. I don't blame her, but I do resent her. A part of me always loved him, even when he was such a horrible person who just wanted me to kill myself. I would have preferred her to step up like an adult and take care of him when he needed it most, instead of dropping him the way she did. He moved back into the house with the explanation that he didn't need his own place without a girlfriend and a daughter. He'd been living in the basement, which is basically a huge studio apartment anyway. Even being in the same house, I never saw him. Usually he was at work or wherever the hell he went when he wasn't home or there. I didn't keep track of his comings and goings. Now, though, I suspect he was at Alicia's grave. Things had faded back to gray when Adkin had his meltdown last Halloween. I don't know why he even wanted to give out candy that night. Maybe it made him feel like less of a failed father. Maybe it made him feel better to see how excited kids were to get the candy. He was drinking when he shot that little boy, but he was definitely not in his right mind before that. Even now, he maintains that he never saw anything but a huge dog barking and jumping at him. Personally, I don't know what I believe. Mostly, I just think the stress finally got to him. He's been in a mental ward of his own after the judge determined him mentally unfit to stand trial. I've never visited him. I never will. Since then, I've had to move into this tiny little studio apartment in the roach-infested and crackhead side of town. I had to sell the house and liquidate literally everything we owned to pay for the legal fees left over from Adkin and Alicia's problems. As much as I'd love to just curl up in bed and not come out again, I now have to work. 6 days a week, I can be found in a sandwich shop a few blocks from my apartment making overpriced footlongs for potheads and meth addicts with 2 teeth in their whole heads. Life is worse now than it's ever been, but I'm still not suicidal. I want to make that really, really abundantly clear. I do not want to kill myself. I don't want to live either, though. That makes my dilemma all the harder. Right now, I'm crossing the street on the way to work. I just stepped out into the crosswalk, and the lights from the bus are blinding. It's holding down on its horn too, so I feel like my eardrums are going to explode. The bus wasn't visible when I stepped out from behind a huge truck parallel parked along the road. The crosswalk light had turned green, and I just started walking because I was already running a little late, and if I didn't get there on time, I was going to be written up again. I guess the bus just didn't have time to stop. My problem is that I have just enough time to get out of the way if I really want to. It may even run over my legs and get me a nice court settlement that would get me out of this ghetto. At the same time, though, all I have to do to end all the bullshit that is my life is to stay right where I am. The massive front wheel of the bus is poised just right to utterly destroy me. I've never thought of how to kill myself because I've never wanted to. But when an opportunity presents itself so perfectly, how can I tell it no?